Have you ever wondered what it might be like to witness something so majestic, so ancient, that it feels almost sacred to behold, to stand in the presence of a legend, not as a distant admirer, but as a silent witness to its truth? That is the journey we begin together today, a story of courage, curiosity, and the delicate balance between reverence and risk. We'd love to know where you're joining us from, whether you're listening beneath a starlit sky or during a quiet afternoon, and what time your own journey into this tale begins. Feel free to share in the comments below. It's always wonderful to feel connected across distances as we explore these timeless wonders together. Deep within the heart of Middle-earth, where the peaks of the misty mountains pierce the clouds and the air itself seems to hum with ancient magic, there exists a secret known to very few: the Great Eagles of Manwë, sentinels of the sky, guardians of an order as old as the world itself. These are not merely birds of prey, but noble beings of profound intelligence and purpose, woven into the very fabric of Middle-earth's balance. To even speak of them feels like whispering a prayer, an acknowledgement of their role as watchers, protectors, and living symbols of a higher wisdom. Yet for all their grandeur, they remain shrouded in mystery, their ways unknown to all but the most daring or devoted. And it is here that our story truly begins, with a young scholar from Rivendell named Alara, whose heart burned with a question that would not let her rest. What could be learned if someone were to look upon the eagles not as myth, but as they truly are? Driven by a desire to document their majesty and prove their vital role in the world's delicate equilibrium, she made a choice that would change her life forever: to secretly observe them from a hidden vantage point among the treacherous cliffs, knowing full well that her mission walked a razor's edge between reverence and rebellion. For if she were discovered, she risked angering not only the eagles themselves, whose power was beyond measure, but also her own people, who valued secrecy and tradition above all. This is where our journey into wonder begins, a forbidden quest, born of devotion, edged with peril, and illuminated by the hope of bringing light to one of Middle-earth's most majestic mysteries. With the quiet determination of someone who knows that even a single misstep could unravel everything, Alara began her ascent up the sheer cliff face. Her fingers, though slender, were strong and sure, finding holds invisible to the untrained eye. A narrow fissure here, a sturdy root there. Every movement was calculated, a silent dance with the mountain itself, as she used her deep knowledge of these ancient paths to avoid the telltale clatter of loose scree or the sudden shift of unstable stone. She was a shadow against the granite, her gray elven cloak pulled tight, her breathing measured and soft. This was more than just a climb. It was an act of devotion, each upward pull bringing her closer to the object of her reverence, each careful foothold a testament to her resolve. The air grew thinner and colder, but her focus was a burning ember within her, pushing her ever higher toward that hidden ledge that promised the view of a lifetime. Without warning, a harsh, guttural shriek shattered the profound silence just above her. Her heart leaped into her throat as a flurry of dark wings and indignant cries erupted from a crevice she had missed. She had disturbed a nest of rock vultures, their sharp beaks snapping in her direction, their alarm echoing off the stone walls and multiplying into a cacophony of outrage. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Her mind raced, presenting her with two stark paths: retreat now, scurry back down to the relative safety of the lower slopes, and abandon her quest before it had even truly begun, or press onward, gambling that the commotion would fade before it reached the wrong ears. The vultures' cries were a beacon, announcing an intrusion to every creature within leagues, including the supremely perceptive eagles she sought to observe from the shadows. In that critical moment of decision, Elara's training overrode her fear. Flight would only make her more conspicuous, a scrambling figure for any watching eyes to follow. Instead, she chose to become part of the mountain. She pressed her body flat against the cold stone, her cloak draping around her like a second layer of shadowy rock. She forced her breathing to slow, her muscles to still, becoming a statue amidst the chaos. It was an incredible test of patience and nerve, to hold perfectly motionless while the agitated vultures wheeled and cried just arm's length away, their sharp eyes scanning for the threat. This single act revealed the depth of her dedication. She would rather risk discovery through absolute stillness than guarantee it by fleeing. The stakes of her secret mission had just escalated dramatically, the fragile veil of her secrecy now trembling with every beat of those angry wings. Then, as suddenly as it began, the disturbance started to ebb. The vultures, finding no further movement from the strange stone-like shape, began to settle back onto their perches, their warning calls softening into disgruntled mutters. A wave of cautious relief washed over Alara, though she dared not move a muscle. She had weathered the first storm of her journey, but just as the last echo of the vultures seemed to fade into the thin mountain air, a new sound reached her ears, a sound that was both distant and immense, cutting through the silence with an authority that could not be ignored. It was a powerful, resonant cry, echoing from some great height above, a sound that spoke of limitless skies and ancient power. It was the cry of a great eagle, and it felt as if the very mountain was listening. The cry was still echoing in the air, a sound so immense it seemed to vibrate in her very bones when she saw him, there, soaring so high above that he seemed to be a part of the sky itself, was Gwaihir, Lord of the Eagles. The sheer scale of him was breathtaking, a living tapestry of sun-tipped feathers and powerful grace. His vast wings, each beat a silent thunder, caught the high-altitude winds with an ease that defied the very concept of weight, casting shifting, ethereal shadows that flowed like liquid darkness over the sun-drenched slopes far below. He was a force of nature given form, a sovereign surveying a kingdom of cloud and stone, and for a moment, Elara forgot how to breathe. A wave of pure, unadulterated awe washed over her, so potent it was almost a physical blow. Her grip on the rock loosened for a single, perilous second, and a small shower of pebbles skittered from beneath her boot, plummeting into the dizzying void. The sudden lurch in her stomach snapped her back to reality, and she slammed herself against the cliff face, her heart hammering against her ribs, not just with the shock of the near fall, but with the overwhelming mix of terror and exhilaration that came from witnessing such majesty. This was the moment she had risked everything for, the very heart of her forbidden quest, laid bare before her eyes in all its magnificent glory, and with that glory came a fierce internal battle. Every instinct screamed at her to remain absolutely still, to become one with the granite, to offer no hint of her presence to this majestic and incredibly perceptive watcher. Yet her scholar's soul, the very core of her being that had driven her up this mountain, cried out for more. It yearned to lean forward, to study the intricate patterns of his flight, to commit every detail of his powerful form to memory. The conflict between caution and curiosity was a silent war waged within her, each second stretching into an eternity as the great eagle continued his wide, vigilant circles. Driven by a determination that finally overrode her fear, she made her choice, moving with a slowness that was almost painful, her muscles protesting every infinitesimal shift. She reached for the one tool that could bridge the impossible distance. From a padded case at her belt, she drew her far-seeing glass, an Elven-made instrument of crystal and polished wood. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised it, the cold metal of the tube feeling alien against her skin. Peering through the lens, the world narrowed and snapped into impossible clarity. Suddenly, she could see the individual feathers on Gwaihir's wings, the keen, intelligent glint in his distant eye, the purposeful, unhurried pattern of his flight as he patrolled the high peaks. She began to mentally document it all: the way he rode the thermals, the specific ridges he seemed to favor, the methodical nature of his watch. This was more than just observation. It was a sacred act of recording a truth few had ever witnessed. But every gain came with its own peril. The high sun glinted off the polished lens of her glass, and she knew that each tiny adjustment she made to track his flight risked sending a telltale flash of light across the mountain side, a bright, artificial wink that stood in stark contrast to the natural world, a beacon shouting her location. It was a dangerous game she was playing, balancing her insatiable need to learn against the very real possibility of alerting the subject of her study. The stakes of her mission were no longer abstract. They were crystallized in that single, gleaming point of crystal that she held so precariously between her fingers. Then, without any warning, the pattern of his flight changed. Gwaihir banked smoothly, his immense form tilting on a current of air, and his new course brought him arcing directly toward the very ridge where she lay hidden. Her blood ran cold. The far-seeing glass felt suddenly heavy and obvious in her hands. She lowered it slowly, pressing herself even flatter against the stone, every sense screaming in alarm. Had he seen the glint? Had some shift in the wind carried her scent? Or was this merely a routine turn in his patrol? As the great shadow of his wings passed over her hiding place, she held her breath, her entire world narrowing to the approaching figure in the sky, her mind screaming a single, silent question. The immense form of Gwaihir drew closer, his great wings beating the air with a rhythm that seemed to shake the very mountain. His head was tilted, those legendary eyes that had witnessed the dawn of ages and the fall of kingdoms, now methodically scanning the cliffs below. Elara watched, her breath frozen in her lungs as that piercing gaze swept across the rock face. It moved past her crevice, then stopped. For a single, heart-stopping moment, it lingered directly on the patch of shadow and stone where she lay concealed. It was not a look of direct sight, but one of deep perception, as if he were sensing a dissonant note in the mountain's silent song, a subtle wrongness in the pattern of the wind. A sensation colder than the mountain stone washed over her. It was a profound and terrifying feeling of exposure, as if her physical camouflage was utterly meaningless. In that moment, she felt not just seen, but known. It was as though those ancient, intelligent eyes could peer past the gray cloth and still form, piercing straight through to the frantic beat of her heart and the whirlwind of awe and fear in her mind. Her every intention, Her secret purpose felt laid bare before this noble creature's judgment. This was no longer a game of hide and seek. It was a soul laid open before a power so vast and venerable that her own seemed like a flickering candle in a hall of eternal stars. A silent, panicked debate erupted within her. One voice, shrill with instinct, screamed for retreat. It urged her to scramble backward, to take her chances on a frantic, dangerous descent, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that searching gaze. The other voice, quieter but forged in the libraries of Rivendell and tempered by her resolve, counseled absolute stillness. It whispered of trust in her elven cloak, trust in her training to become one with the environment, trust that any movement now would be a confirmation of the suspicion she felt growing in the air. To flee was to declare herself an intruder. To hold fast was to perhaps still be mistaken for a trick of the light, a curious fox, a part of the mountain itself. With a willpower that felt like iron, Elara made her choice. She chose faith over flight. She forced every muscle to relax, sinking into the contours of the rock, letting her body go limp and heavy. She became a student of her own breathing, slowing it until it was as shallow and silent as a creature in deep hibernation. Her eyes remained open, fixed on a point just beyond the eagle, refusing to meet his gaze directly for fear that even that would somehow betray her. She was a stone. She was the gray lichen on the stone. She was nothing but a part of the ancient, silent cliff, relying on centuries of elven wisdom in the art of concealment to protect her now. The stakes of this decision could not have been higher. Discovery meant more than just a fright or a scolding. The wrath of a great eagle was a legendary thing, a force of nature that could sweep an intruder from the mountainside with a single beat of its mighty wings. But perhaps even worse was the thought of being reported. If Gwaihir carried word of a foolish elf spying on their sacred duties back to Lord Elrond, her reputation would be shattered. She would be seen as reckless, a meddler in affairs beyond her station, and the very work she hoped would honor the eagles would be forever tainted by the shame of her disobedience. Her entire future, her standing among her people, and the success of her life's ambition hung in the balance of this single, motionless moment. Then, just as the tension seemed poised to snap, the eagle's head tilted the other way. His gaze released its hold on her hiding place, sweeping back toward the open sky, as if dismissing the fleeting sensation. A wave of tentative relief, so potent it made her feel weak, began to wash over Alara. But fate, it seemed, was not yet done with its tests. As Gwaihir began to turn his great body away, a capricious mountain wind, a sudden updraft born from the warming rocks below, curled up the face of the cliff. It swirled around her, lifting the edges of her cloak, and carried with it the unmistakable scent of her presence, the faint aroma of the Rivendell herbs in her pack, the scent of leather from her journal, and the simple, living scent of elf, and sent it drifting directly into the path of the departing Lord of the Eagles. The subtle shift in the wind was a calamity in its silence. Gwaihir, who had been moments from continuing his majestic patrol, suddenly arrested his movement. His great wings cupped the air, arresting his forward momentum with an almost supernatural grace, and he began a slow, deliberate turn. He descended in a tightening spiral, his head cocked to one side in a gesture of pure, unvarnished curiosity. His immense golden eyes, sharper than any elven lens, were now fixed with unnerving precision on the general area where Alara lay hidden. The unfamiliar scent, a delicate mix of parchment ink, sun-dried leather, and the distinct vitality of an elf, had reached him, a strange and intriguing note in the mountain's familiar symphony of stone and sky. A cold dread, entirely separate from the chill of the rock against her cheek, seized Alara's heart, making it pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. All her scholarly theories about the eagle's legendary senses were suddenly, terrifyingly confirmed. Their perception was not merely keen, it was profound, an integral part of their being as sentinels. A misplaced scent on the breeze was not a minor anomaly to them. It was a breach in the sanctity of their domain, a thread pulled from the tapestry of their watchfulness. Her hiding spot, so carefully chosen, was now utterly compromised. She was no longer a hidden observer, but a detected anomaly, and the full weight of that realization crashed down upon her. A violent internal debate erupted within her, each option more fraught with peril than the last. One path, born of pure instinct, screamed for escape. It painted a vivid picture of a frantic, scrambling retreat down the treacherous cliff face, a desperate gamble with the loose rocks and sheer drops, where a single misstep would mean a plummet into the abyss. It was a path of pure fear, offering the slim chance of vanishing before the eagle could fully identify her. The other path was one of incredible courage. It whispered of standing her ground, of acknowledging the immense power before her, not with flight, but with a gesture of profound respect and peaceful intent. It was a gamble of a different kind, one that required her to trust in the eagle's renowned nobility over their formidable might. In that suspended moment of choice, the scholar in her, the part that revered these creatures above all else, found its voice. To flee would be to declare herself a threat, a sneaking intruder to be pursued and dealt with. To stand and show herself, however, was to declare herself a person, an individual who, while foolishly trespassing, came with open hands and a heart full of reverence. Drawing upon a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed, Elara made her decision, moving with a slowness that was both respectful and painfully deliberate. She began to extricate her arms from where they were pinned beneath her. She kept her movements smooth and unambiguous, her eyes lowered in a gesture of deference, until her empty hands were raised above the ledge, palms open and facing the sky in the universal, ancient gesture of peace. It was a silent plea, a wordless confession that she meant no harm. The stakes of this simple gesture were astronomical. In the space of a single heartbeat, her entire fate now hung in the balance of how this majestic lord of the skies would interpret her signal. Her open hands could be seen as a surrender, a respectful acknowledgement of his authority that might appeal to his wisdom and mercy, calming the situation and opening a door, however slight, to communication. Or they could be misinterpreted as a provocation, a sudden movement from a hidden foe that might trigger a swift and devastating defensive reaction. The encounter was poised on a knife's edge, escalated from a secret observation to a direct, silent dialogue between two very different beings, with the power dynamic overwhelmingly tilted in one direction. For a long moment, Gwaihir did nothing but watch her, his great head still tilted, his expression inscrutable. The only sound was the sigh of the wind through the high crags. Then, a deep, Resonant rumble emanated from his chest, a sound that was less a cry and more a vibration felt in the bones. It was a low, questioning call that carried across the distance with an undeniable weight of purpose. It was not a sound of anger, but one of communication, and as its last note faded into the thin air, a shape began to detach itself from a bank of cloud to the north. Another immense eagle, answering the summons with powerful, swift wing beats. From the billowing white clouds to the north, a second form emerged, its approach silent and swift. Landruval, brother to the Lord of the Skies, glided into the scene with a grace that seemed to bend the sunlight itself. Where Gwaihir was power and authority, Landruval carried an aura of serene vigilance, his feathers shimmering with 1,000 hues of bronze and gold as he caught the light, each one a polished scale in a living suit of armor. He took his place beside his brother, and together they began a slow, deliberate circling pattern directly above Alara's ledge, their immense shadows merging into a single, shifting pool of darkness that enveloped her completely. The weight of their combined attention was a physical pressure, a palpable force that made the thin mountain air feel as dense as water. Where moments before she had felt the singular, piercing focus of one eagle, she now felt the full, unblinking scrutiny of a council. Two pairs of ancient, knowing eyes now studied her from different angles, their silent communication, a terrifying mystery. Her sense of vulnerability wasn't just doubled, it was magnified exponentially, transforming her from a curious observer into a solitary figure, standing trial before the highest court of the mountains. Every slight tremor in her raised hands felt amplified under their gaze. Every racing heart beat a thunderous confession of her fear. Internally, a storm of anxiety raged. She fought to keep her posture open and non-threatening, her palms upturned, her body language screaming submission and respect, while her mind screamed a very different story. It conjured images of being judged not just as a trespasser, but as a spy, a thief of secrets, a blight on their sacred solitude. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, threatening to unravel her composure and send her scrambling backward in a blind panic. Yet beneath that fear, the scholar's flame still flickered. She knew that direct speech, in any tongue, would be useless and likely alarming. She needed a different language, a universal currency of intent that could bypass words and speak directly to the soul. Drawing upon the deepest wells of her elven heritage, she made a choice that felt both desperate and inspired. Closing her eyes for a brief second to block out the terrifying sight above, she let her fear settle. Then she parted her lips and began to hum. It was not a song of power or magic, but a simple, soft elven hymn of respect, one sung by children to honor the ancient things of the world. The melody was gentle and flowing, like water over smooth stones, a tune that spoke of reverence for nature, for the sky, and for the guardians who watched over it. The sound was faint at first, barely more than a vibration in her throat, but she poured all her benevolent intention into it, hoping the music could carry what her words could not. The stakes of this fragile performance were impossibly high. This musical offering was her final, most honest gambit. A positive reaction, a tilt of the head, a calming of their tense postures, any sign of recognition or acceptance would mean they understood her heart. It could transform her in their eyes from a suspicious intruder into a curious, perhaps even welcomed, admirer. It was the difference between being seen as a friend and being judged a foe. But a negative reaction, a dismissive shriek, an aggressive dive, a clear sign of irritation, would confirm her worst fears. It would brand her a nuisance, an irreverent disturbance worthy only of being swept from their domain. Her entire quest, her safety, and her future now hung on the delicate threads of a single, trembling melody. For a moment, there was only the wind and her soft, steady hum. Then Landruval, who had been studying her with intense curiosity, shifted in the air. He let out a cry, but it was unlike any she had heard before. It was not the mighty challenge of a predator, nor the short, sharp call of an alarm. This was a melodic, questioning sound, a series of rising and falling notes that seemed to weave through the air with a musicality of its own. It didn't echo her tune precisely, but rather answered it, playing with the same tonal structure and gentle rhythm, as if he were engaging in a call and response. The sound held no trace of anger. Instead, it shimmered with a thoughtful, almost intrigued curiosity, a noble creature recognizing an attempt at communication and deigning to answer. Encouraged by Landruval's musical reply, a spark of hope ignited within Alara's chest. She let her humble hum swell into a fuller, clearer melody, the ancient Elven hymn now flowing from her with renewed confidence. She wove new phrases into the song, not with words of her own making, but with the old, revered titles and epithets used in the oldest tales of her people. She sang of the eagles as the wind lords, the sentinels of the misty peaks, the eyes of Manwe upon Middle-earth. Her voice, though still soft, carried a depth of genuine admiration, each note a brushstroke, painting a portrait of her profound respect for their eternal vigil. She was no longer just trying to appease them. She was offering them a tribute, a musical acknowledgement of their sacred duty. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. The two great eagles, who had been holding a cautious altitude, began to descend. Their immense wings beat the air not with the powerful strokes of pursuit, but with slow, deliberate beats that seemed to hang in the moment, a silent accord to the rhythm of her song. They drifted lower, their vast shadows shrinking to envelop just her and the ledge, their keen eyes fixed upon her. The sharp, suspicious glint in those golden orbs began to soften, replaced by a look of deep, contemplative interest. Their heads tilted, not in predatory assessment, but in the manner of wise scholars listening to a fascinating recitation, their expressions shifting from evaluating a potential threat to considering a curious supplicant. Yet, even as this small victory unfolded, a fresh wave of tension tightened her throat. Was her voice, trembling slightly with cold and awe, truly conveying the sincerity burning in her heart? Or did it sound thin and reedy to these majestic beings, a pathetic imitation of the grand mountain choirs they must be accustomed to? She feared her mortal offering might be seen as insufficient, a child's ditty sung before masters of symphony. The trust she so desperately sought felt like a fragile thread, and she knew she needed to strengthen it, to move beyond general praise and offer something personal, something that proved her connection to them was more than just academic curiosity. Drawing a steadying breath in the brief space between verses, she made a decision. She would share a memory, letting the hymn's melody continue as a gentle undercurrent. She began to sing in a more narrative tone, her voice painting a picture with sound. She sang of a day, years ago, when she was a young apprentice high in the western reaches of the mountains. She sang of a great storm, of lightning striking the peak of Zurak's sigil, and of a single aged figure clinging to the stone. Then she sang of the miraculous sight that followed the sudden, glorious descent of two great eagles, their feathers like living storm clouds, who with immense gentleness and power bore the falling wizard, Gandalf, away from certain doom and into the safety of the skies. The stakes of this shared story were terrifyingly high. This was no longer a general song of praise. It was a specific, personal testament. If the eagles before her recognized the event, if they themselves were the very heroes of that tale, it would create an instant and powerful bond, a shared memory that transcended species and language. It would prove she was not some distant admirer, but a witness to their nobility, her reverence earned through their own actions. But if they did not know of it, if this was some other eagle's deed, or if her account was flawed, her story could ring hollow. It might be perceived as clumsy flattery, an attempt to manipulate them with a tale she thought they wanted to hear, and that would shatter the fragile connection she had just begun to build. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she finished the musical recollection, her eyes searching theirs for any sign of recognition, her entire future poised on the edge of their reaction. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the slow, powerful beat of their wings. Then Gwaihir, the Lord of the Eagles, did something that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. He banked smoothly, breaking from his gentle circling, and descended toward a broad, flat-topped outcrop of rock that stood just a short distance from her ledge. His landing was a masterpiece of grace and controlled power, a mere whisper of immense talons on stone, his great wings folding against his body with a soft rustle like a settling forest. He stood there, regal and immense, his gaze no longer distant and scanning but directly, intently focused on her. His eyes, deep and intelligent, held a newfound intensity, a look that seemed to see past her fear, past her song, and straight into the core of her being. The air itself grew still, heavy with unspoken questions, and the weight of his silent, powerful presence. There was a stillness in the air, a silence so profound it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then, with a grace that belied his immense size, Gwaihir took a single step forward. The sound of his talon meeting the stone was a soft, definitive click that echoed in the quiet. He lowered his great head, tilting it to one side, and in the vast, golden depths of his eye, Alara saw the entire sky reflected, a boundless expanse of blue and white, and within that, the tiny, terrified reflection of her own form. She was a mere speck before him, a fragile creature of flesh and bone in the presence of a living legend, a being whose history was woven into the very foundations of the world. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was a sovereign who could, with a single, effortless motion, end her life if he judged her a threat. The honor of the moment was so immense, it was almost indistinguishable from pure terror. A silent, critical debate raged within her, a clash of instinct and intellect. One part of her, the part that understood protocol and the deference owed to such ancient power, screamed that she should bow. To lower her eyes, to make herself small and unthreatening, was the safest course, a universal language of respect that might appease his majestic authority. Yet another part, the stubborn core of the scholar who had scaled a mountain alone, argued for holding her ground, to stand tall, to meet his gaze with steady courage, might show him that she was not merely a frightened intruder, but an individual of purpose and conviction, worthy of being seen as something more than a nuisance to be dismissed. The choice was agonizing, each option carrying its own monumental risk of misinterpretation. In the end, her decision was not one of defiance, but of profound reverence. Moving with a slowness that was both deliberate and respectful, she began to lower herself. She did not simply bow, she knelt, a gesture of deep fealty, used only for the highest of elven lords and the most sacred of occasions. The cold of the stone seeped through her trousers, but she paid it no mind. Her movements were a silent prayer, an acknowledgement of his sovereignty over this domain. Then, in the most vulnerable act of all, she reached for the leather-bound journal at her belt, the very symbol of her secret purpose, the repository of all her observations and theories, and placed it carefully on the ground before her. She laid it flat, open, and exposed, its pages vulnerable to the mountain winds. It was the ultimate sign of transparency and trust, a wordless offering that said, "My intentions are here. My secrets are yours to see. I hide nothing from you." The act of placing her life's work on the stone between them was a gamble that made her heart hammer against her ribs. This deliberate vulnerability was a blade that cut two ways. On one edge, it could be the key that finally unlocked his trust. By willingly surrendering the object of her mission, she demonstrated that her curiosity was born of admiration, not espionage. It showed a humility that acknowledged his right to judge her work and her presence. But the other edge was sharp and dangerous. To a creature of such immense power and pride, this kneeling figure with her offered book could easily be perceived as weakness, a suspicious attempt to placate him with a token, or worse, a diversion. It could mark her as someone without the courage of her convictions, someone who, when faced with true power, simply folded and offered up her secrets in a desperate bid for mercy. The stakes of this single, silent gesture had never been higher, transforming the encounter from a confrontation into a moment of raw, unspoken judgment. For a long moment, Gwaihir simply looked from her kneeling form to the journal and back again, his expression an inscrutable mask of ancient wisdom. Then he moved. His great head dipped lower, and with a gentleness that was astonishing for a beak that could rend stone, he nudged the edge of the leather-bound book. It was not an aggressive push, but a curious tap, the action of a discerning intellect encountering a strange artifact. The journal slid a few inches across the stone, its pages fluttering softly. He then lifted his gaze back to hers, his piercing eyes holding a new, unmistakable expression. It was no longer just assessment or curiosity. It was a clear, silent question. The tilt of his head, the focused intensity of his look, all seemed to ask, "What is this? Explain yourself." The burden of breaking the silence, of finding words that could bridge the impossible gap between them, now rested entirely on her shoulders. Her voice, though still trembling slightly from the awe of his proximity, found a steadier ground as she began to speak. She did not look at the journal, but kept her eyes respectfully lowered, addressing the great eagle before her with the reverence one might show a king or a sage. "I am a scholar," she began, the words feeling both too small and entirely necessary. "From the house of Elrond in Rivendell. My name is Alara. This book. It holds not secrets meant for spying, but observations born from a deep and abiding admiration. She paused, gathering her courage. For my entire life, I have studied the old tales, the histories that speak of your kind. Of the Wind Lords, the Sentinels of Manwë, I have listened to the songs that praise your vigilance, your strength, your unwavering role as guardians of the free peoples of Middle-earth. She dared a glance upward, her heart in her throat, searching his ancient eyes for any sign of understanding, or worse, dismissal. But tales and songs, as beautiful as they are, fade with time. They change with each telling. I fear that the true depth of your greatness, the precise detail of your majesty, could one day be forgotten, reduced to mere legend whispered around campfires. Her voice grew stronger, infused with the passion that had driven her up the mountain. My mission, my only purpose, was to create something more enduring. To use the skills I possess, to observe, to document, to draw, to create a true and honest record, a testament, so that those who come after, in ages yet unborn, might look upon these pages and know with certainty the magnificence of the Great Eagles. Not as myth, but as living, breathing protectors to be honored and revered. As she spoke, she gently turned the pages with a careful finger, revealing more of her work. There were intricate studies of individual feathers, noting the subtle variations in color and structure from primary to covert. There were diagrams attempting to map the powerful musculature of a wing in flight, annotated with her own theories on aerodynamics. Most prominently, there were sketches of eagles in various poses, soaring on a thermal, perched regally on a peak, their heads tilted in that characteristic way that spoke of immense intelligence. Every line was drawn with a painstaking hand, every note written in a clear, elegant script. It was the work of a lifetime, a labor of love and profound respect, laid bare for its subjects to judge. The tension in the air was a living thing, as palpable as the mountain mist. With every turned page, Elara's internal anxiety spiked. What if her anatomical guesses were completely wrong, an insult to their perfect form? What if a casually sketched expression, meant to look noble, was interpreted as arrogant or mocking by these perceptive beings? Her depictions, though created with the purest intent, were still just that, depictions. They were a mortal's interpretation of an immortal reality, and the gap between her perception and their truth felt like a yawning chasm. She was offering them a mirror, and she waited in agony to see if they would recognize the reflection she had tried so hard to make true. The stakes of this silent review were absolute. Approval from these noble lords would be more than just permission to leave unharmed. It would be a blessing, a validation of her life's work that would elevate it from a personal project to a sanctioned chronicle. It would mean her dream of sharing their legacy with the world could become a reality, backed by the very authority of the subjects themselves. But the opposite outcome was unthinkable. Disapproval could mean the instant and violent destruction of her journal, every painstaking sketch and note torn to scraps on the wind by a dismissive Talon. Worse, it could be confiscated, taken from her as forbidden knowledge to be locked away in some high eyrie, forever lost to the world she had hoped to enlighten. Her heart, her purpose, her very identity as a scholar, all rested on the precipice of their judgment. Then a change occurred. Gwaihir, who had been studying the pages with an intensity that seemed to absorb every ink stroke, let out a sound. It was a soft cry, low and resonant, completely unlike his previous powerful calls. It was a sound of communication, rich with nuance, directed not at her, but toward his brother still circling above. In response, Landruval's circling pattern tightened. With a few powerful, silent wing beats, he descended, landing with a soft rustle of feathers on the outcrop beside Gwaihir. The two immense eagles now stood shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent low over the small, open journal lying on the stone. The space felt suddenly smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more consequential. The solitary judgment of one lord had become a council of two, and Alara's fate now rested in the shared perception of the brothers of the sky. For what felt like an eternity, the silence was broken only by the soft rush of wind over stone and the occasional rustle of a turning page. Then, a new language began to unfold between the two majestic beings. Gwaihir and Landroval lifted their heads from the journal, their focus shifting entirely to one another. A series of low, resonant calls passed between them, each one nuanced and complex, rising and falling in a cadence that felt unmistakably like debate. It was not the harsh cries of alarm or challenge Elara had heard before, but a flowing exchange of tones, a conversation in a tongue far older than any spoken by elf or man. Their communication was not solely vocal. Subtle gestures accompanied the sounds, a tilt of a head toward the journal, a slight shift of a wing in her direction, a meaningful glance exchanged between them. It was a silent ballet of deliberation, each movement and note carrying a weight of meaning she could sense but not decipher. They were weighing her, judging her work, debating the very essence of her presence in their sacred space, and she was utterly outside of the process, a subject awaiting a verdict from a court she could not petition. The weight of that silent judgment was a physical pressure on her shoulders, keeping her kneeling on the cold stone, every second stretched into an agonizing hour, filled with the terrifying unknown of their discussion. Her entire future, not just this day, but the entire purpose that had defined her life, hung suspended in the balance of their ancient wisdom. The fate of her precious journal, the sketches and notes that represented years of devoted study, the dream of sharing the eagle's true majesty with the world. All of it was being decided in a language of cries and gestures she could not understand. The urge to speak, to try once more to explain herself, to beg for their understanding, rose in her throat like a fever. She wanted to tell them again of her admiration, to promise anything if they would only let her work continue. But a deeper, calmer instinct held her tongue. To interrupt this council, to impose her own desperate voice upon their profound deliberation, would be the height of disrespect. It would reveal an impatience and a selfishness that would undo all the respect she had tried to show. Patience, she realized, was the final and greatest test of her reverence. And so, she made a conscious choice to surrender completely to their process. She kept her eyes lowered, not in fear, but in a conscious act of deference to their authority and wisdom. Her hands remained open and resting on her knees, her posture one of quiet acceptance. She would not fidget, she would not plead, she would not even allow her anxiety to show on her face. She would embody the trust she claimed to have in their nobility. She would show them, through her stillness and her silence, that she respected their right to judge her. This was their domain, their law, and she was a petitioner within it. Her only remaining power was to accept their decision with grace, whatever it might be. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, to will her racing heart to calm and simply wait. The stakes of their private council could not have been higher or more starkly opposed. On one side lay a possibility, so glorious it made her dizzy to consider it: unprecedented access. Their acceptance could mean permission to observe, to learn, to document, not from a fearful distance, but from a place of honored trust. She could become the first chronicler of their true lives, privy to secrets of the sky known only to them. Her work could become the definitive testament she had always dreamed of, a bridge of understanding between the eagles and the world below. But on the other side lay a consequence so final it felt like a death, permanent banishment. Their rejection could mean being cast out from the mountains forever, forbidden from ever setting foot in their realm again. Her journal could be taken or destroyed, her life's work erased in an instant, and the very subject of her passion made into a source of eternal sorrow. It was the difference between a dream fulfilled and a dream obliterated, and the decision was entirely, terrifyingly, in their hands. Then, the subtle exchange of calls and gestures ceased. The two eagles fell silent, their great heads turning in unison, away from each other and back toward her. The council had reached its end. Gwaihir, the lord of the eagles, took a single step forward, his immense form blocking out the sun. His golden eyes, ancient and inscrutable, fixed upon her kneeling figure. For one last heart-stopping moment, he simply looked at her, and Alara felt the entirety of her existence being measured in that gaze. Then, in a movement that was both simple and profoundly significant, he dipped his great head toward her. It was not a nod of mere acknowledgement, but a slow, deliberate bow of respect, a clear, unambiguous gesture of acceptance. The tension that had held the world in a vise grip shattered, and in its place bloomed a feeling of such immense relief and awe that it threatened to overwhelm her completely. The silent verdict was in, and she had been found worthy. The profound bow of the Eagle Lord was more than just acceptance. It was an unspoken key, turning in a lock, opening a door to a world she had only ever dreamed of entering. Gwaihir lifted his great head, and with a deliberate, graceful sweep of his massive wing, he gestured toward the highest reaches of the mountain range. His talon pointed unmistakably to a distant peak, one shrouded in a permanent halo of mist and cloud, its outline shimmering with an otherworldly light. The meaning was as clear as the high-altitude air. She was to follow them. They were not sending her away. They were inviting her in, leading her to the heart of their domain, to the legendary sacred Eyrie, spoken of only in the most ancient and reverent of Elven lays. A torrent of conflicting emotions crashed over Elara so powerfully, she felt physically unsteady. A thrill of pure, undiluted joy shot through her, a sensation so bright and sharp, it was almost painful. This was it. This was the moment every fiber of her being had yearned for, the validation of every risk taken, every fear faced. She was being offered a gift beyond measure, a chance granted to so few throughout the long history of Middle-earth that it might as well have been a myth. To walk, or even to be carried, into the innermost sanctum of the Great Eagles was an honor that would redefine her entire existence. Yet, intertwined with that brilliant joy was a cold, coiling thread of primal terror. These were beings of immense, almost unfathomable power. Their motives, their ancient ways, were utterly alien to her. Was this truly an invitation, or was it the prelude to a different kind of judgment? one that would take place away from any prying eyes. To place her complete trust in them was to surrender all control, to leap into the unknown with faith as her only guide. The internal conflict was a silent, frantic war. One voice, the voice of the rational scholar, trained in Rivendell, urged caution. It whispered of legends that spoke of the eagles' fierce pride and their absolute authority over their realm. It painted vivid pictures of hidden perils, of ancient magics woven around their nests that could ensnare an unwary mortal mind, of the sheer, physical danger of ascending to a peak where the air itself was thin and treacherous. To follow blindly was to accept every possible risk, known and unknown, but the other voice, the voice of the heart that had driven her up the cliff face, spoke of the respect in Gwaihir's bow, the curiosity in Landruval's melodic cry, the patient way they had examined her journal. It argued that true understanding required trust, and that this gesture was the ultimate test of the reverence she claimed to hold. To refuse now would be to insult the very nobility she had spent her life admiring. With a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Alara made her choice. She would choose wonder over worry. Moving with a deliberate slowness that hid the tremor in her hands, she reached for her journal, where it still lay open on the stone. She closed it with a soft, definitive snap, the sound a period at the end of her old life. She secured the leather strap, her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment, as if drawing strength from the work it contained. Then she tucked it safely back into her belt and looked up, meeting Gwaihir's gaze directly. She did not speak. Words felt too small, too clumsy for this moment. Instead, she simply nodded, a single, firm dip of her head that communicated everything. Her gratitude, her trust, her readiness to follow wherever they led, into wonder or into peril. The decision was made. The stakes of this silent agreement were monumental, escalating her journey from a personal quest into a pivotal moment with ramifications she could not possibly foresee. This was no longer just about her journal or her curiosity. By accepting this invitation, she was stepping into a role far greater than that of a mere observer. She was potentially becoming a conduit, the first elf in an age to be granted intimate knowledge of the eagle's ways. The ancient secrets she might learn could reshape the understanding of all the free peoples of Middle-earth, fostering new alliances and strategies against the shadows that still lingered in the world. But with that potential came immense danger. The path to such secrets was likely guarded by more than just physical heights. It could be fraught with tests of spirit and mind, with revelations that might be overwhelming for a mortal heart to bear. She was trading the known dangers of the cliff for the unknown perils of profound revelation, as if sensing the scale of the commitment she had just made, and perhaps understanding the limitations of her earthly form. Landruval took a single, gentle step forward. He lowered his immense body, folding his powerful legs beneath him and settling onto the stone outcrop with a soft rustle of feathers. Then he did something that truly stole the breath from Elara's lungs. He angled his great wing downward, creating a feathered ramp from his shoulder to the ground, and turned his head to look at her, his intelligent eyes holding a clear, unspoken offer. The message was breathtaking in its generosity and its sheer impossibility. He was not asking her to make the arduous, likely impossible climb to their sacred peak. He was offering to carry her. The invitation was not just to follow, It was to ascend, to experience the world as they did, if only for a little while. The journey to the Eyrie would not be a trek, but a flight. The offer hung in the air, a moment of such profound significance that Alara's mind could scarcely process it. To ride upon the back of a great eagle was a privilege reserved for the most legendary of figures in the oldest tales, Gandalf the Wizard, or the heroic Baron of the First Age. It was not an honor ever extended to a mere scholar from Rivendell. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and disbelief. The sheer physical reality of it was overwhelming. The powerful slope of Landruval's back, the individual feathers each as long as her arm, the living warmth that radiated from him. This was not a steed to be mounted, but a sovereign being offering an unimaginable gift. Hesitation was a cold knot in her stomach. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the surprisingly soft down at the base of his neck feathers. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to decline, to find a safer path, to keep her feet on solid, dependable stone. But the scholar in her, the part that had always yearned to see the world from a new vantage point, recognized this for what it was, the ultimate lesson, the deepest immersion into the reality of the eagles she could ever hope to receive. Swallowing her fear, she moved forward. With a carefulness born of immense respect, she found a secure hold where his neck met his shoulders and pulled herself up, settling into a natural dip between his wings. Her legs gripped his sides, and she buried her fingers deep into the thick, strong feathers, holding on as if her life depended on it, because in that moment, it absolutely did. Then, with a powerful surge of muscles that she felt through her entire body, Landruval pushed off from the ledge. There was no running start, no gradual ascent. One moment they were on solid ground, and the next, the world fell away in a breathtaking, stomach-lurching drop. The rush of wind was instantaneous and immense, tearing the breath from her lungs and whipping her hair back from her face. They were not just flying, they were falling into the sky, and for one terrifying second, Elara was certain she had made a catastrophic mistake. Her eyes squeezed shut, her entire being consumed by a primal vertigo, a dizzying fear of the unimaginable drop yawning beneath her. She could feel the raw power in Landruval's shoulders, the effortless beat of his wings that caught the air and transformed their fall into a graceful, soaring ascent. It was a sensation unlike any other, a thrilling, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating dance with the abyss. The conflict within her was as fierce as the wind. The fear was a living thing, a cold voice whispering of the fragility of her grip, the sheer insanity of trusting her life to the strength of feathers and the skill of a creature she had only just met. One missed handhold, one sudden, unexpected bank, and she would be plummeting into the vast, open emptiness below. Yet, warring with that fear was an awe so potent, it brought tears to her eyes, tears that were instantly swept away by the rushing air. She could feel the sun-warmed strength of Landruval beneath her, the absolute certainty in every movement of his wings. This was not a reckless beast. This was a master of the sky, a being born to this element, and he carried her with a conscious, deliberate grace. The trust she had to muster was not blind faith, but a reasoned acknowledgement of his supreme skill. In that moment of internal struggle, high above the world where the air was thin and clean, Alara made a conscious, courageous decision. She would not let fear blind her to this miracle. Slowly, forcing her eyelids to open against the screaming wind, she chose to see. The view that unfolded before her stole what little breath she had left. The world was not a map below her. It was a living, breathing tapestry of incredible scope. The misty mountains were no longer intimidating barriers, but a magnificent, jagged spine of stone rolling away into the hazy distance. The forests were a sea of green velvet, the rivers shimmering threads of silver stitching the land together. She could see for leagues, to the edges of the world she knew and into lands she had only read about in ancient texts. This was the eagle's perspective, not just a view, but an understanding. From this height, one could see threats forming, watch the slow turn of seasons, and grasp the interconnectedness of all things in Middle-earth. It was a lesson in scale, in patience, and in guardianship, learned not from a book, but from the sky itself. The stakes of this flight were as stark and simple as the drop below. The sheer physical danger was ever present. A single lapse in concentration, a moment of weakened grip, a sudden gust of turbulent wind, and her journey would end in a final, tragic fall. There was no margin for error, no safety net woven of magic or hope, but the potential reward was equally absolute, a prize beyond any academic achievement. To successfully complete this flight was to gain an insight that was literally unparalleled. She was experiencing the world through the senses of the eagles, understanding the wind currents they rode, seeing the landmarks they used for navigation, feeling the immense responsibility that came with such a vantage point. This was the heart of her quest, the deep, immersive knowledge she had risked everything for, and it was being granted to her not as an observer, but as a participant, if only for a short while. As they flew on, Gwaihir keeping a steady, watchful pace beside them, the character of the mountains began to change. The rugged, broken peaks gave way to a series of sheer, inaccessible cliffs, their faces smoothed by millennia of wind and weather. And then she saw it. Ahead, nestled within a colossal alcove, carved into the side of a mountain that seemed to touch the very ceiling of the sky, was a broad, hidden ledge. It was not a mere outcropping of rock, but a proper platform, wide and level, adorned with structures that could only be the fabled nests of the great eagles. They were not haphazard piles of twigs, but immense, carefully woven boles of entire trees and sturdy branches, each one a fortress and a sanctuary. And there, perched like living statues upon the rim of the ledge and atop nearby spires, were other eagles. Dozens of them, their forms regal and still, their keen eyes watching the approach of their lord, his brother, and their unprecedented guest. Their silent, collective gaze was a weight that settled over her, a new and formidable audience awaiting her arrival. The descent was a gentle glide, a world away from the heart, stopping plunge into the sky. Landruval's wings cupped the air with a master's precision, slowing their flight until his powerful talons met the broad, sun-warmed stone of the platform with a soft, definitive click. The journey was over. They had arrived. As Alara carefully dismounted, her legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline and the unfamiliar posture, the full majesty of the place washed over her. This was no mere ledge. It was a sanctuary, a city in the sky. All around her, woven into the very fabric of the mountain alcove, were the nests of the great eagles. They were not simple constructions of twig and branch, but vast, intricate bowls built from whole young saplings and sturdy, weathered timber, each one a testament to generations of care and a formidable fortress against the elements. The air itself felt different here, thinner, cleaner, and humming with a profound, ancient silence that was more felt than heard. And within that silence, she was being watched. Perched on the high spires of stone that framed the eyrie, and along the edges of their immense nests, were more eagles than she could quickly count. They did not stir or call out. They simply observed, their postures regal and still, their keen, intelligent eyes fixed upon her with a calm, undemanding curiosity. There was no hostility in their gaze, but there was an immense weight to it, the collective scrutiny of an ancient and noble culture, assessing a singular, unprecedented arrival. She felt the sheer scale of her presumption anew, a mere mortal standing in the innermost heart of a realm few of her kind had ever glimpsed. The exhilaration of the flight was tempered instantly by a deep, humbling awe, a sense of her own profound smallness in the presence of such gathered majesty. This was the moment she had both dreamed of and dreaded. The physical journey was complete, but the far more delicate social one was just beginning. She was an outsider here, a being from a different world with different customs, standing on a ground that was not just physically sacred, but socially intricate. Every movement, every gesture, every word she might utter would be measured against an unknown code of conduct. A misstep born of simple ignorance, a direct stare interpreted as challenge, an overly familiar approach seen as disrespect, could unravel the fragile thread of trust that had brought her here. The tension was no longer about survival, but about belonging. It was a subtle, internal pressure to prove herself worthy, not just of their curiosity, but of their acceptance. Drawing upon every lesson in diplomacy and history she had learned in the halls of Rivendell, Alara made a conscious decision. She would lead not with explanation, but with respect. Smoothing her travel-worn tunic and ensuring her journal was securely tucked away, she took a single, careful step forward, placing a respectful distance between herself and Landruval. Then she performed the formal greeting of her people, reserved for the highest of lords and the most sacred of occasions. She placed her right hand over her heart, bowed her head deeply, and then swept her arm out in a graceful arc, her palm open and upward in a gesture that conveyed both offering and receipt. When she spoke, her voice, though soft, was clear and steady, carrying easily in the thin, quiet air. I bring greetings from the house of Elrond in Rivendell, and I offer my most sincere and humble thanks for the great honor of this invitation. Your home is magnificent beyond any song or story, and I enter it with the utmost respect for its peace and its sanctity. She did not presume to look directly at any one eagle, but kept her gaze lowered, focusing her words to the assembly as a whole. It was an acknowledgement of their collective authority and a promise that she understood the privilege she had been granted. She was not here as a conqueror or an equal, but as a grateful guest in a hall of kings. The stakes of this precise performance could not be higher. Her entire future, and the future of the understanding she hoped to build between their kind and the world below, hinged on this first impression within their most sacred space. Positive reception would transform her status from a curious anomaly to an honored guest, opening doors to conversation, shared knowledge, and a deeper, more meaningful chronicle of their lives. It would be the validation of her entire life's work and the beginning of a new chapter in the long history of the Eagles. But a misstep, a gesture perceived as arrogant or ignorant, would see that trust evaporate instantly. She would be relegated to the status of intruder, her presence tolerated but never welcomed, her observations forever limited to the superficial. The dream of a true testament would die here, on this stone platform, not with a roar, but with a silent, final withdrawal of regard. For a long moment, there was only the sigh of the wind through the high crags. Then, a subtle shift occurred within the gathered eagles. There was no audible signal, but the collective attention focused, the calm curiosity sharpening into something more specific. From the deepest part of the eyrie, where the stone met the shadow of the overhanging cliff, one of the eagles stirred. He was larger than even Gwaihir, his immense form speaking of unimaginable age, and his feathers were not the rich browns and golds of the others, but were silvered and white, as if touched by starlight or hoarfrost. He stepped forward with a grace that belied his size, each movement deliberate and laden with ancient authority. The other eagles subtly inclined their heads as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of his precedence. He stopped before Alara, his head tilting as he looked down at her, and when he spoke, his voice was not a cry or a shriek, but a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stone beneath her feet, a voice that had shaped the winds for ages. The voice that emerged from the elder eagle was not a sound one heard with the ears alone. It was a resonance felt deep within the chest, a vibration in the very bones, as if the mountain itself had found a tongue. It was low, like distant thunder given shape and meaning, and each word was measured, weighted with the immeasurable passage of ages. "I am Thorondor," the voice intoned, and the name hung in the thin air, a legend given flesh and feather before her. His eyes, ancient and clear as a winter sky, held her with a gaze that seemed to see not just her face, but the entire tapestry of her life, from her first steps in Rivendell to her perilous climb up the cliff. Few of your kind have ever stood where you now stand. Speak then, and let us know the purpose that has brought you to this sacred place. What is it you hope to learn? Elara felt the weight of the question settle upon her shoulders, a physical pressure as tangible as the mountain stone. Her mind, usually so quick with words and theories, went utterly still, stunned into silence, not just by the fact of speech from a creature of legend, but by the profound gravity behind it. This was no simple query. It was an invitation to lay her soul bare before a judge whose wisdom had been old when the world was young. Her carefully prepared explanations, her scholarly justifications, all crumbled to dust in that moment. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and clarifying, that anything less than absolute, unvarnished truth would be instantly perceived as the hollow echo it was. Her answer had to be more than clever. It had to be true. A fierce internal struggle began. How does one articulate a lifetime of devotion, a burning, almost sacred curiosity, to a being for whom a lifetime is but a single season? She feared her words would seem childish, the naive fantasies of a mortal who could not possibly comprehend the scale of the duty she sought to document. Would her passion be mistaken for mere selfish ambition, a desire for personal glory built upon their ancient, private legacy, the temptation to embellish, to frame her mission in the most grand and flattering terms, was a whisper in the back of her mind. But looking into Thorondor's patient, knowing eyes, she understood that such artifice would be the deepest insult of all. He was not asking for a performance. He was asking for her heart. Drawing a steadying breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, Alara chose the path of raw honesty. She did not look away from his gaze, but met it with a sincerity that cost her every ounce of her courage. Great Thorndor, she began, her voice softer than she intended, yet clear in the immense silence. I am but a scholar, a keeper of tales and a seeker of truths. My purpose, it is not to learn secrets for my own gain, or to boast of having walked among you. She paused, gathering the core of her belief. I have spent my life studying the history of Middle-earth, and in every age, in every great turning of the world, the same noble figures appear, the great eagles, servants of Manwe, guardians who intervene not for conquest, but for preservation. But as the ages pass, memories fade, grand deeds shrink into simple rhymes for children, and profound truths are worn smooth into pleasant legends. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by the conviction that had driven her up the mountain. I fear that the full depth of your legacy, the precise and awesome truth of your vigilance, could one day be forgotten. My hope is not to learn for myself, but to preserve for others. I seek to create a record, a testament so clear and so true that all races, elves, men, dwarves, and hobbits, might look upon it and remember. They must remember that when shadows gather, there are watchers in the high places. They must know that the balance of this world is guarded by strength and wisdom beyond their own. I wish to honor your role, not as myth, but as documented history, so that your protection may never be taken for granted or fade from the memory of those you guard. The stakes of her confession could not have been higher. The air in the eyrie seemed to thicken, holding its breath along with her. Thorndor's expression remained an inscrutable mask of ancient patience, giving no hint of his thoughts. His approval would be more than just permission to stay. It would be an endorsement, a granting of access to the deepest wells of Eagle lore, a chance to witness their ways and understand their counsel. It would transform her quest from a forbidden gamble into a sanctioned chronicle, but his disapproval would be a final, absolute verdict. It would mean her journey ended here, on this ledge, her hopes and her journal left behind as she was escorted from their realm, forever forbidden from returning. The dream of a bridge between their world and hers would die in the silence following her words. For a long moment, the only sound was the eternal wind sighing through the high crags. Thorndor did not move, his immense silver-white form as still as the mountain itself, his timeless eyes seeing not just her, but the echoes of her intention. Then, with a slowness that was itself a form of speech, the great elder eagle dipped his head in a single, deep, and deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of exuberant welcome, but one of solemn, measured acceptance. He had heard the truth in her voice and had found it worthy. Without a word, he turned his great head and gestured with his beak toward the very edge of the stone platform, where the world fell away into a breathtaking vista of cloud and peak. It was a clear, silent command for her to join him, to see the realm she wished to document from the most privileged vantage point of all. Thorndor's gaze seemed to look through her and then past her, as if focusing on a point in time rather than space. To understand our watch, he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to pull the very air closer. You must first understand our beginning. We are the Eagles of Manwë, the Elder King, whose domain is the air and the winds that course over all the world. We were not born of this earth as the beasts of field and forest, but were given form and purpose by his thought, conceived as his eyes and his voice in the mortal realms, sentinels placed here to witness, to safeguard, and on rare occasion, to intervene. The words were not a boast, but a simple, profound statement of fact. and they settled over Elara with the weight of eons. He spoke then of the First Age, of a world younger and wilder, where the shadows were deeper and the light more brilliant. His tales were not dry histories, but vivid tapestries woven from memory. He described the siege of Angband, the great fortress of the Dark Lord Morgoth, and how the eagles kept a perpetual watch from the peaks of the encircling mountains, their eyes missing no movement in the vast, blighted plain below. He spoke of the great eagle lord, who bore the elven king Fingon upon his back to rescue his cousin Medros from a terrible imprisonment upon a cliff face, an act of mercy that mended a rift between kindreds and altered the course of the wars against the darkness. Each story was a thread in a grander design, revealing a pattern of vigilance that had endured while kingdoms of elves and men rose and fell beneath them. Elara's hand flew across the pages of her journal, her charcoal stick a blur. She was no longer merely taking notes. She was attempting to capture lightning in a bottle, to trap the echo of thunder on paper. She sketched frantic maps of forgotten battlefields based on his descriptions, drew the likeness of long-fallen elven lords from the reverence in his tone, and tried to capture the terrifying majesty of the first dragons, whose fire and shadow were a blight upon the sky that only the bravest eagles dared to challenge. Her previous understanding, cobbled together from scrolls and second-hand songs, felt like a child's drawing compared to the masterpiece being unveiled before her. She was not just learning history, she was drinking it from the source, and it was both exhilarating and profoundly humbling. A quiet anxiety began to gnaw at the edges of her wonder. The scale of it all was so vast, the timeline so impossibly long. Thorondor spoke of centuries as if they were seasons, of millennia as passing years. How could her mortal mind, which measured a life in mere decades, ever truly comprehend the patience required to watch over an entire continent for age upon age? She feared her questions would seem trivial, her interpretations naive. Would her sketches of their great deeds seem like cheap caricatures to those who had lived them? The weight of doing justice to this legacy felt heavier than any mountain, and for a moment her hand stilled, frozen by the fear that her best efforts would forever fall short. Pushing that fear aside, she knew silence was the greater failure. When Thorondor paused, his story of the War of Wrath hanging in the air like the silence after a great storm, she looked up from her work, her expression one of rapt focus. Lord Thorondor, she began, her voice soft but clear. You speak of watching the movements of armies and the machinations of dark lords, but the wind sees everything, from the greatest to the smallest. In all your long watch, have you ever found your attention caught not by the march of armies, but by the simple, steadfast courage of a single, small soul struggling against the shadow? It was a question that sought not just facts, but perspective, a window into how these ancient beings measured worth and courage. Thorondor considered her, and for the first time, something akin to a deep, thoughtful warmth seemed to gleam in his ancient eyes. The wind sees the mountain for its strength, he rumbled, but it also hears the whisper of a single leaf upon its slope. A small act of defiance in a dark place can ring as clearly in the high air as the shout of a great captain. It is not the scale of the deed, but the purity of the light within it that draws our eye. We have borne hobbits, the smallest of beings, for they carried the greatest of burdens, and their quiet courage outshone the glitter of armies. Her question had pleased him. It showed she was listening not just to the events, but to the nature of their duty. The quality of the light in the high eyrie began to change, the brilliant white of the high sun softening into the deep gold of late afternoon. Long, stretching shadows painted the stone platform, and the air grew cooler. Elara realized hours had passed in what felt like moments, so lost had she been in the flow of epic tales. Her journal was now filled with more than just notes. It held the seeds of understanding, a chronicle of duty that spanned the life of the world itself. Her ability to listen with such deep respect, to ask questions that honored the spirit of their service, and not just the events, was being carefully noted by all the assembled eagles. Their initial curiosity was slowly transforming into a quiet regard. She was proving herself a worthy vessel for their trust. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of violet and fire, Thorndor shifted his immense weight. The history lesson was complete. "You have listened to the tales of how we have watched," he said, his voice seeming to blend with the sigh of the evening wind. "But to truly understand, you must also understand how we speak across the distances of that watch. The wind is our messenger and our medium. Come, the light fades, but the night has its own lessons." He rose, gesturing for her to follow him to the very edge of the eyrie, where the world fell away into the gathering dusk, offering to show her the invisible language that bound their scattered kindred together across the leagues. Thorndor led her to the very edge of the stone platform, where the world fell away into a breathtaking expanse of darkening sky. "The wind does not merely carry our cries," he began, his voice a low hum that seemed to harmonize with the evening breeze. "It is the parchment upon which we write, the instrument we play. To speak to the wind is to trust it with your message, to shape it with breath and feather, and to release it with intent." As he spoke, he demonstrated. A single, primary feather on his left wing tilted at a precise angle, catching a current of air rushing up the cliff face. Simultaneously, he released a soft, vibrating call from deep in his throat, a sound that was less a note and more a feeling of resonance. The combination was not loud, but it was incredibly specific, a targeted pulse of energy that shot into the rising air and vanished toward the north almost instantly. "That was a greeting for a patrol nearing the high pass," he explained. "It tells them the area is watchful and at peace." Alara watched, utterly captivated. This was the heart of it, the practical mechanics of a language she had only ever theorized about in the margins of her Rivendell texts. She had hypothesized that the eagles must possess a sophisticated means of long-distance communication, but to see it in action, to understand that it was a fusion of physical gesture and vocalization, perfectly attuned to the mountain's own breath, was to witness a miracle of natural engineering. Her scholar's mind raced, trying to catalog the angle of the wing, the pitch and timbre of the call, the specific wind current he had chosen. It was a language without nouns or verbs as she knew them, but one of immediate, actionable meaning, a syntax of urgency, peace, warning, and location, woven directly into the fabric of the air itself. With a courage fueled by sheer fascination, she knew she had to try. "May I?" she began, her voice small against the vastness. Thorndor dipped his great head in permission. Stepping forward, she faced the same updraft, feeling its cool strength against her face. She raised her arms, attempting to mimic the elegant angle of his wing, but her human limbs felt clumsy and inadequate. lacking the fine control and surface area of a primary feather. She then took a deep breath and attempted the call. What emerged from her throat was a thin, reedy whistle, a pathetic imitation of the deep, resonant vibration he had produced. It was a sound that spoke of effort, not mastery, a shout into a gale where his had been a seamless part of it. A soft, chiming sound rustled through the eyrie. From their perches on nearby nests, several of the younger eagles, who had been watching the lesson with keen interest, let out a series of gentle clicks. The sound was not harsh or mocking, but bore the unmistakable tone of amused affection, the way an elder might gently chuckle at a toddler's earnest but comical attempt to walk. The warmth in the sound did little to ease the cold wave of humiliation that washed over Alara. Her face flushed, and she dropped her arms, suddenly feeling the immense, foolish presumption of her attempt. She was a creature of the ground, trying to speak the tongue of the sky. Her clumsy effort hadn't just failed, it had highlighted the unbridgeable chasm between her mortal nature and their immortal grace. The fear was acute and painful, that this divide would now define her in their eyes, marking her as an amusing curiosity rather than a sincere student, forever limiting how much of their world they would be willing to share. But the shame was met instantly by a surge of the same stubborn determination that had driven her up the cliff face. She would not be defined by her failure, but by her response to it. Clenching her fists at her sides, she made a silent vow. She would not retreat from this challenge. She would practice this single, simple greeting until her arms ached and her throat was raw. She would not rest until she could produce something, however small, that was no longer a source of amusement, but a genuine token of respect. It was no longer about mastering their language. That was likely an impossible dream. It was about the act of trying itself, the willingness to stand on the edge of the world and humbly offer her flawed effort as a tribute to their perfection. It was about proving that the divide between mortal and immortal was not a barrier to reverence. The stakes of her persistence were now intimately personal, yet they held profound implications for her entire mission. Success in this smallest of gestures, even a halting, imperfect one, would be a key. It would demonstrate a respect that went beyond words, a dedication to understanding them on their own terms. It could unlock a deeper level of trust, convincing Thorondor and the others that she was worthy of more complex lessons, of witnessing how they coordinate rescues or warn of storms. But continued failure, an inability to grasp even the foundational principles of their communication, would subtly but permanently relegate her. She would remain the guest who needed things explained, the observer who could not participate, and her access to their deeper wisdom would inevitably be constrained by that perception. Her future in the eyrie hinged on this moment of humble, tireless practice, and so she began again. Ignoring the warmth in her cheeks, she raised her arms, focusing not on replicating Thorondor's immense form, but on finding the purest expression of the gesture her own body could manage. She tilted her hands, listening for the change in the wind's whisper over her skin. She took another breath, and instead of forcing a loud call, she focused on creating a low, steady hum in her chest, trying to find the vibration that felt like the mountain's own heartbeat. She did it again and again. Each attempt was a silent prayer of dedication, a physical manifestation of her promise to honor their ways. Then, a new presence joined them at the cliff's edge. Gwaihir, who had been observing from a respectful distance, moved forward with a quiet power that shifted the very air around them. He did not speak, but looked to Thorondor, a silent question passing between them. Receiving a slight nod from the elder, Gwaihir turned to Alara, his gaze holding not amusement, but a focused intensity. He then added his own immense voice to her practice. He did not override her feeble hum, but wove around it, his own deep, resonant call, creating a complex harmony that made the air around them shimmer. It was a supportive foundation, a musical structure upon which he could try to build her own small note. His powerful wings, with minute-precise adjustments, began to demonstrate the gestures again, slower this time, breaking down the fluid motion into its core components, offering a patient, wordless masterclass in the language of the sky. The lesson was no longer a demonstration. It had become a duet between immortal mastery and mortal striving, and the very atmosphere of the Eyrie seemed to stir with the powerful, rising harmonies of their combined effort. The air around the high Eyrie seemed to change its very nature, transforming from a mere medium of sound into a living, resonant instrument. Elara's humble, earth-bound voice, though thin and reedy compared to the eagle's immense power, did not vanish into the night air. Instead, it was caught and lifted by the harmonic foundation Gwaihir and Landruval provided, their deep, vibrating calls weaving around her melody like mighty golden threads through a delicate silver strand. She was no longer just mimicking, she was contributing, her voice becoming a single, vital part of a greater, more beautiful whole. The music they created was unlike anything conceived in the halls of elves or men. It was a song of the sky itself, a conversation of trust, translated into sound, and the very stone of the Eyrie seemed to hum in sympathetic vibration, amplifying their shared creation into something that felt both magical and profoundly natural. This unexpected harmony sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated joy through Alara, so potent it momentarily silenced the constant whisper of her insecurities. The bond that had been forming through shared stories and silent respect was now being forged in the fire of shared creation, strengthening into something tangible and deep. She was not just an observer being tolerated. In this moment, she was a participant, a musician in an ancient, celestial choir. The eagles, for their part, seemed to lean into the music with a newfound focus. Their calls, usually so purposeful and declarative, took on a playful, exploratory quality, as if they were genuinely intrigued by this novel collaboration and the unique texture her mortal voice added to their timeless symphony. The space between species, between mortal and immortal, seemed to shrink within the embrace of the music, replaced by a simple, powerful connection of mutual creation. Yet, even within this breathtaking moment, a sliver of her old anxiety persisted. The sheer physical disparity between her voice and theirs was undeniable. Her lungs burned with the effort of sustaining notes against the thin, cold air, and her throat felt raw. A part of her feared that her contribution, though offered with her entire heart, was ultimately insignificant, a faint whisper easily drowned out by the thunderous beauty of their song, a reminder of the fundamental limitations that would always separate her from their world. This internal conflict between the soaring joy of connection and the grounding fear of inadequacy created a poignant tension within her, a bittersweet awareness that this miracle was, by its very nature, fleeting for a being of her brief years. driven by a need to offer something that was truly and wholly her own, to give back a gift worthy of the honor they were bestowing upon her. Alara made a decision. She let the simple practice melody fall away and began to improvise, weaving new words into the elven hymn she had sung on the cliffside. She created a new verse, born directly from the hours she had spent listening to Thorondor's wisdom. Her voice gained strength as she sang not of general praise, but of specific, witnessed nobility. She sang of the watch over Angband's dread gates, of the rescue upon Thangorodrim's peak, of the endless vigilance against the creeping shadows. She sang of their role as the eyes of Manwe, the listeners to the wind's whispers, the guardians who measured courage not by the size of the army, but by the strength of the heart within the smallest chest. She was giving them back their own history, refined through her reverence and offered up to them as a musical tribute. The reaction from the eagles was immediate and profound. Their rhythmic calls shifted to match the cadence of her new verse, their voices becoming a powerful, supportive chorus to her lyrical narrative. It was the ultimate validation. They were not just accepting her song, they were joining it, affirming the truth of her words with their own immortal voices. The combined melody swelled, becoming a majestic anthem under the starlit sky, a testament to shared history and newfound understanding. The moment hung in perfect, resonant balance, a culmination of her entire journey where acceptance felt not just possible, but assured. The stakes of this musical offering could not have been higher, for it held the power to crystallize her entire standing within the Eyrie. Success would solidify their acceptance of her, transforming her from a curious guest into an honored chronicler, an individual whose unique perspective and sincere devotion were valued additions to their ancient culture. This shared creation would become the foundation of all future trust, the proof that a bridge between their world and hers could not only exist but thrive. However, failure, if her improvisation had been seen as presumptuous, her mortal voice an unwelcome intrusion into their sacred forms of communication, would have the opposite effect. It would starkly remind them of her limitations and her inherent otherness, effectively halting the deepening of their relationship and likely confining her to the role of a passive observer whose project had reached its natural, final limit. As the last note of their shared anthem faded, leaving a silence that felt richer and more meaningful than any noise, Thorondor stepped forward, the elder eagle's eyes, which usually held the timeless depth of the night sky, now gleamed with a warmth that was entirely present and approving. He looked from Elara to the eastern horizon, where the first faint hint of gray was beginning to soften the absolute black of night. "You have sung of our watch with understanding that is rare," he rumbled, his voice a gentle vibration in the post-song quiet. "And so, with the dawn, you shall not merely hear of it, but see it with your own eyes. You are granted the honor of joining the Dawn Patrol. It is time for you to witness the vigilance you have so beautifully praised in action." The deep, resonant call of Gwaihir, here was her alarm, a sound that vibrated through the stone of the Eyrie and pulled Alara from a sleep filled with soaring dreams. The sky was still a deep, velvety indigo, the stars not yet faded, but the Lord of the Eagles was already stirring, his immense form a darker shadow against the pre-dawn gloom. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. The beginning of the Dawn Patrol was a matter of ingrained duty, a ritual as old as the mountains themselves. Alara scrambled to her feet, her fingers fumbling slightly with the clasp of her cloak in the biting cold, her heart already racing with a potent mix of anticipation and solemn responsibility. This was not a sightseeing flight. It was a privilege earned, an invitation into the most sacred and practical aspect of their existence, and she felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders as she hurried to join them. Landruval was waiting, patient and immense, and she climbed onto his back with a familiarity that still felt surreal. As they launched into the still, cold air, the world below was a tapestry of monochrome shadows, details blurred and hidden in the pre-dawn darkness. But as they gained altitude, circling higher and higher above the sacred eyrie, the first sliver of molten gold breached the eastern horizon. The transformation was breathtaking. That single ray of light seemed to unlock the world, flooding the valleys with definition and setting the peaks ablaze. For a moment, Alara was lost in the sheer beauty of it, her artist's soul yearning to capture the play of light and shadow on an impossible canvas. But the eagle's focus was elsewhere, and she quickly reined in her wonder, understanding that this daily miracle was, for them, merely the turning on of the world's lights, the signal that their most critical watch had begun. What followed was a masterclass in focused vigilance that left her humbled. Gwaihir and Landroval fell into a precise, wide-ranging flight pattern, their heads constantly moving in slow, deliberate arcs, their incredible eyes scanning the waking world below with an intensity she could feel. It was a systematic, all-encompassing survey. She watched, utterly fascinated, as Gwaihir's head would snap to a minute movement in a distant valley, a movement her own eyes couldn't even perceive, only for him to dismiss it a second later, having identified it as a herd of deer startled by a mountain cat. Landruval would track the lazy, rising spirals of smoke from a woodman village hearth, not as a threat, but as a data point, a confirmation of a peaceful awakening. They were filtering the entire world beneath them, categorizing every motion, every sound, every scent on the wind with a speed and accuracy that was almost supernatural. They weren't just looking, they were reading the land. Her journal was in her hand, her charcoal flying across the page, but she was no longer sketching grand poses or majestic landscapes. Her notes became a frantic, detailed log of their process. She diagrammed their flight patterns, noting how they used the rising thermals to hold a stationary position for minutes at a time, providing a stable observation platform. She scribbled observations about their communication, the subtle, almost imperceptible tilts of a wingtip from Gwaihir that would send Landruval veering to investigate a specific area, the soft, low clicks they used to confirm a sighting was benign. She documented the sheer scope of their watch. They tracked not just potential enemies like wandering orc bands or trolls, but also the migration patterns of great herds, the buildup of storm clouds gathering over the Sea of Rune, even the delicate early bloom of certain mountain flowers that indicated a change in season. Their duty was to the balance of all things, great and small. The greatest internal conflict she faced was the constant, pressing urge to ask questions. 100 of them bubbled up inside her every minute. What was that? How can you see that far? What does that particular cry mean? Her scholar's mind was screaming for clarification, for deeper understanding. But she held her tongue, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. She knew, with absolute certainty, that a single untimely word, a sudden noise from her, could break their profound concentration, at a critical moment. A distraction could cause them to miss a crucial detail, a hidden threat, and that failure could have dire consequences for the innocent people living in the shadows of these mountains. Her role was to be a silent witness, her presence a testament to their trust, and she would not betray that by being a disruptive passenger, her questions would have to wait. Her duty now was to observe and record, to be the eyes and ears that would later translate their silent vigilance into a story the world could understand. This self-imposed silence amplified the stakes of the entire experience. It was no longer just about her personal quest for knowledge or her desire to create a beautiful chronicle. Her presence on this patrol was active, not passive. She had become a variable in a complex and delicate equation of guardianship. Any failure on her part, a dropped journal, a gasp of surprise, an ill-timed sneeze, wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a potential breach in the security of the realm they protected. The trust the Eagles had placed in her was not a gift. It was a responsibility, and the weight of it was as tangible as the cold morning air. She was determined to prove that trust was not misplaced, that a mortal could indeed understand and respect the gravity of their eternal watch. Then, in the midst of this silent, methodical ritual, everything changed. Gwaihir, who had been holding a perfect, graceful hover on a thermal, suddenly stiffened. His head, which had been making its steady scanning arc, snapped to a fixed point far to the east. His entire posture shifted from one of observation to one of alarm. A low, guttural sound, completely unlike the soft communication clicks from moments before, rumbled in his chest. With a sharp, unmistakable jerk of his great head, he signaled to Landruval, and without a single wasted movement, both eagles banked hard, their powerful wings beating with a new, urgent purpose. Their peaceful, wide-ranging patrol was over. They were now on a direct, swift course toward a distant, dark smudge on the horizon that had not been there moments before. A thin, grim plume of black smoke rising against the brightening sky. The serene rhythm of the dawn patrol shattered in an instant. Gwaihir's entire body, a moment ago a picture of graceful equilibrium, went rigid with a sudden, electric tension. His head, which had been making its methodical sweep of the horizon, snapped to a fixed point far to the east, his keen eyes locking onto a threat only he could yet perceive. A low, guttural rumble, entirely different from the soft communicative clicks he'd used moments before, echoed from his chest, a sound of pure alarm that vibrated through the air. With a sharp, decisive jerk of his magnificent head, he signaled to his brother, and without a single wasted motion, both eagles banked hard, their powerful wings beating with a new, urgent purpose. Their wide-ranging vigil was over. Their course was now direct and swift, aimed like an arrow toward a thin, grim plume of black smoke that was just beginning to stain the brightening sky above the distant tree line near the Great Anduin River. A cold rush of adrenaline, sharp and unmistakable, flooded through Alara, momentarily overriding the awe of the flight. This was no longer an observation. This was an activation. The theoretical guardians from Thorondor's stories were now the practical heroes, diving toward a real crisis, and she was hurtling toward it with them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the wind. A storm of conflicting emotions erupted within her, a scholar's desperate hunger to witness this legendary protective instinct in action warred with a mortal's primal fear of the unknown danger below. What would they find? A simple lightning strike fire? A band of marauding orcs? Her mind conjured a dozen terrifying possibilities, each more frightening than the last, and she felt a terrifying sense of her own fragility. She was an academic, not a warrior, armed with nothing but a journal and a lump of charcoal. In that moment of soaring terror, a silent, critical choice presented itself. She could succumb to the fear, becoming a passive, paralyzed weight on Landruval's back, a mere spectator to the events about to unfold, or she could find a way to be present, to offer whatever meager assistance she could, to prove that the trust they had placed in her was not a burden they would come to regret. Gritting her teeth, she made her decision. She tightened her grip on Landruval's strong feathers, anchoring herself firmly, and leaned forward slightly, squinting her eyes against the rushing air to better scan the approaching landscape. She might lack a sword or a bow, but she possessed a scholar's keen eye for detail, a knowledge of geography, and a deep, unwavering desire to help. She would be their second set of eyes, their ground-level strategist, their willing hands, whatever they needed her to be. The stakes of their diverted flight escalated with every powerful beat of Landruval's wings. That distant smudge of smoke was no longer an abstract sign of trouble. It was a potential catastrophe unfolding in real time. It could be a simple forest fire, yes, but one that threatened to consume homes and lives if left unchecked. It could be an attack, a deliberate act of malice that had already inflicted suffering and demanded immediate intervention. The lives of woodmen, of innocent animals, the very sanctity of the forest itself, all of it now hung in the balance, dependent on the speed and efficacy of the eagle's response. Elara's own safety and the success of her entire unprecedented mission were now inextricably linked to the outcome of this emergency, transforming her scholarly quest into a shared trial by fire. As they drew closer, the evidence of the crisis began to assault her senses long before the full picture was clear. The first change was the air itself. The clean, cold scent of the high mountains was abruptly fouled by a harsh, acrid tang that stung her nostrils and caught in the back of her throat. The unmistakable smell of burning wood, pitch, and life being consumed by flame. Then, carried on the same wind that brought the smoke, another sound reached her ears, faint at first, but growing clearer and more horrifying with every second. The desperate, high-pitched cries for help, human voices, twisted by fear and pain, cutting through the low, ominous roar of the inferno they were rapidly approaching. The world below transformed from a map into a living nightmare. The forest was no longer a sea of green, but a churning, roaring maw of orange and black, devouring everything in its path. Towering ancient trees became torches, their leaves vanishing in bursts of sparks, while a thick, choking blanket of smoke blotted out the morning sun, turning the day into a hellish twilight. And within the inferno, she could see them, the desperate, moving shapes. A family of deer, trapped against a wall of flame, their panicked cries rising above the fire's roar. And closer to the riverbank, a small group of woodmen, their faces smudged with soot and etched with terror, were desperately beating at the encroaching flames with cloaks and branches, their escape route cut off by a fallen, burning pine. The sheer scale of the devastation hit Alara like a physical blow, her heart pounding a frantic, horrified rhythm against her ribs. This was no longer a story in a book. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time, and the urgency of it was a cold fist closing around her own throat. A violent internal war erupted within her. Every instinct, every shred of her compassion screamed at her to act, to leap from Landruval's back and rush into the fray, to grab a branch and help beat back the flames, to pull the smallest child to safety. Her muscles tensed with the urge to move, to do something, anything, other than just watch from the safety of the sky. But a cooler, more rational voice, honed by hours of observing the eagle's flawless coordination, fought back. She was not a firefighter, she was a scholar from Rivendell. To charge in blindly would not make her a hero, it would make her another victim, a complication for the immensely powerful beings she was with to rescue. Her role was not to lead, but to support. She had to quell the storm in her own heart and place her absolute trust in the skill and the strategy of Gwaihir and Landroval to become an asset to their effort, not a liability driven by panic. Swallowing her fear, she forced her mind to shift from empathy to analysis. She was not a warrior, but she was an expert in the geography of these lands. She had spent years poring over maps and walking these very river valleys, and that knowledge was a weapon she could wield. Leaning forward, she shouted over the roar of the wind and fire, her voice strained but clear, directing her words toward Gwaihir's keen ears. The river bends sharply just ahead. The current is slower there, and the bank is clear of brush. It could be a safe landing point. And to the west, behind the woodman, there is an old game trail. It cuts through a rocky outcrop the fire hasn't reached yet. It could be a path out. She was offering not commands, but data, transforming her intimate knowledge of the land into a tactical advantage for the eagles, using her unique skills to guide their immense power to the most effective places. The stakes of every second, every decision, were terrifyingly absolute. This was not a theoretical exercise or a lesson in eagle lore. The lives of every creature trapped in that blazing valley hung in the balance, and any mistake, any moment of hesitation or miscommunication could be the difference between survival and a horrifying end. A misjudged flight path could send Landruval into a plume of superheated air that could ground him. A poorly chosen landing zone could put rescued survivors directly back in the fire's path. The trust the eagles had placed in her by bringing her here was now a shared burden of life and death, and the weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. Responding to her shouted guidance with a swift, decisive dip of his wings, Gwaihir acknowledged her information. He banked away from the direct rescue, climbing higher above the central conflagration. Then, with a power that stole Elara's breath, he began to beat his vast wings not for flight, but with a specific, tremendous force aimed downward. Each powerful stroke drove a massive wave of compressed air toward the heart of the fire, not to fan it, but to smother it. The effect was immediate and awe-inspiring. The raging flames in a large area directly below him flattened and guttered, as if a giant, invisible hand were pressing down upon them, creating a temporary, swirling clearing of breathable air and dampened embers. It was a breathtaking display of controlled, elemental power, a deliberate and strategic effort to starve the fire of the oxygen it craved and create a pocket of safety within the chaos. Simultaneously, Landruval, now clear on the best approach, folded his own wings and dropped into a steep, controlled dive. He ignored the terrifying walls of flame on either side, his focus absolute, his flight path a straight line toward the huddled group of woodmen that Alara had pointed out. His shadow passed over them, a brief respite from the oppressive heat, before his great talons, usually weapons of war, reached down with astonishing gentleness. They closed not around flesh, but around the leather tunics of two of the largest woodmen, lifting them from the ground with a smooth, powerful motion. The men shouted in shock and fear, but it was the fear of salvation, not attack. With powerful wing beats that kicked up a storm of ash and sparks, Landruval rose, carrying them up and away from certain death, turning swiftly toward the safe bend in the river Alara had described, his first precious cargo secured. The rescue had begun in earnest, a perfectly coordinated ballet of wind and will, and the frantic beating of drums from the northern tree line signaled that their work was far from over. Landruval's dive was a blur of focused power, a controlled plunge into the heart of the inferno. His immense shadow fell over a small, terrified figure huddled against a burning log, a woodman child, utterly alone and paralyzed by fear. With a precision that defied his size and the chaos around him, Landruval's talons, capable of shredding armor, closed with infinite gentleness around the child's tunic, lifting them from the searing ground as effortlessly as if plucking a flower. At the same moment, Gwaihir executed a maneuver of breathtaking force and strategy. Hovering directly above the most intense cluster of flames, he began to beat his colossal wings, not for lift, but with a tremendous, downward driving motion. Each powerful stroke acted like a giant's hammer, slamming vast columns of air onto the fire, momentarily crushing the flames and creating a swirling, temporary barrier of clearer air and dampened embers in his brother's wake. It was a stunning display of their symbiotic power, one providing rescue, the other creating the very possibility for it to happen. A wave of pure, unadulterated admiration washed over Alara, so potent it brought fresh tears to her smoke-stung eyes. She wasn't just watching a rescue, she was witnessing a perfect, seamless partnership forged over millennia, a dance of salvation where every movement was instinctive and every action perfectly timed. Her heart swelled with a fierce, protective pride for these noble creatures, and for a single, glorious second, the terror of the situation was eclipsed by the sheer honor of being allowed to witness their heroism firsthand. But that moment of wonder was instantly crushed by the returning urgency of the crisis. As Landruval rose with the child safely secured, Alara's sharp elven eyes, scanning the hellscape below, caught a new flash of movement near the base of a rocky cliff face, where the fire was beginning to climb the dry brush. Another small group of woodmen, 3 of them, were desperately trying to claw their way up the sheer rock, their retreat cut off by a wall of flame that had just closed in behind them. A cold knot of panic tightened in her stomach, shouting directions from this height, over the roar of the fire and the wind, felt like trying to whisper across a thunderstorm. Would Landruval even hear her? Would her descriptions make any sense from his aerial perspective? The landmarks she could see, the distinct fork in a half-burned tree, the peculiar shape of a boulder, might be completely invisible or confusingly similar to other features from above. What if her well-intentioned guidance only sent him on a wild goose chase, wasting precious seconds that these trapped people simply did not have? The pressure was immense and paralyzing. The distance between her brain, formulating a plan, and her voice, delivering it, felt like a yawning chasm that could easily swallow lives. Gritting her teeth, she shoved the doubt aside. Hesitation was a luxury that meant death. Drawing upon every map, every scroll, every long hike through these very woods she had ever studied in Rivendell's library, she forced her voice into a clear, piercing shout, leaning forward to direct her words toward Landruval's keen ears. Landruval. The cliff face. Look to the eastern rock wall, near the lightning-blasted pine that splits in two. There are three, trapped at its base. The fire is closing from the south. She didn't use terms like left or right, which could be disorienting from the air, but relied on absolute geographic markers and distinctive natural features, transforming the landscape below into a grid only someone with her scholarly knowledge could read and relay. The stakes of this desperate communication were agonizingly simple and absolute. Every syllable she uttered, every second that passed between her observation and his understanding, was measured in heartbeats, the heartbeats of the people below. A moment's confusion, a single misheard word, and the window of opportunity would slam shut, the advancing flames claiming another victory. It wasn't just about the immediate rescue. The fire itself was a living, hungry enemy. Any delay in clearing this area of survivors would force Gwaihir to maintain his exhausting, powerful wing beats longer, risking his own strength and potentially allowing the fire to find a new path and surge forward with renewed fury, undoing all their hard-won progress and threatening even more of the ancient forest. With the last group of survivors plucked from the cliff base and borne away to the safety of the riverbank, a palpable shift occurred in the valley. The frantic, desperate energy of the rescue began to ebb, replaced by the grim, steady work of containment. Gwaihir continued his methodical assault on the main body of the fire, his powerful wings now smothering the larger pockets of flame that remained. The once raging inferno was now a landscape of smoking ruin and scattered, manageable blazes, the immediate threat to life seemingly past. A fragile, exhausted relief started to settle over Alara, her white-knuckled grip on Landruval's feathers finally easing. But just as she began to believe the horror was over, a new sound cut through the low crackle of dying embers and the sigh of the wind, a sound that was utterly foreign to this place and infinitely more sinister. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration, felt more than heard, a pounding that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Then it grew clearer, carried on the wind from the north, the relentless, menacing beat of war drums. The rhythmic, pounding beat of war drums was a sound that did not belong in the waking world, a vile corruption of the morning's peace that slithered from the northern tree line and coiled around the heart. From the shadowed depths of the forest, a band of orcs surged forth, their crude armor and jagged weapons glinting in the fire-tinged light. They were scavengers and opportunists, drawn by the chaos like carrion crows to a battlefield, seeing not a tragedy, but an opening, a chance to attack the weary, vulnerable woodmen and pick the bones of a ravaged land. Their guttural shouts of anticipation joined the drumbeat, a symphony of pure malice that shattered the fragile calm. In an instant, the entire energy of the eagles transformed. The focused, purposeful drive of rescue vanished, replaced by a swift and terrifying shift to pure, unadulterated defense. The gentle, communicative clicks and resonant calls were gone, replaced by cries that were sharp, fierce, and battle-ready, a sound that spoke of ancient wrath and a power that could shatter stone. Gwaihir and Landroval were no longer rescuers. They were warriors of the sky, their immense forms now poised not for saving, but for striking. The air itself seemed to crackle with their rising fury, a palpable force of nature gathering itself against the approaching darkness. Suddenly, Elara felt a vulnerability more acute than any she had known on the cliff face or in the fire. On Landruval's back, she was exposed, a stationary target high above the fray, utterly unarmed and defenseless. A sword would have been useless in her hands, a bow, a child's toy against this threat. Her only shields were the feathers beneath her, and the immense beings who now focused their entire attention on the enemy below. Her survival, and the survival of the woodmen now scrambling for cover, depended entirely on the eagle's skill and her own ability to not become a liability they were forced to protect. The intellectual pursuit of knowledge had collided with the brutal reality of violence, and she was completely out of her element. A frantic debate erupted in her mind. The instinct to curl into a ball, to make herself small and hope the danger passed her by, was almost overwhelming. But watching the orcs advance, seeing their numbers and their clear intent to slaughter the survivors, that passive fear curdled into a cold, determined anger. She might not have a weapon, but she was not without resources. She had her voice, trained in the echoing halls of Rivendell to carry in song and story. An idea, born of equal parts desperation and courage, took hold. If she could not fight, she could create a distraction. She would use her voice not as a tool of peace, but as a weapon of confusion. Drawing a breath that burned with the lingering smoke, she made her choice. She filled her lungs and began to sing. But this was not the soft, reverent hymn of the mountainside or the harmonious tribute of the Eyrie. This was a loud, piercing elven battle tune, one of dissonant notes and sudden, jarring shifts in pitch, a melody designed centuries ago to disrupt concentration and shatter enemy formations. She poured all her fear, all her fury into the song, aiming the sharp, unnerving sounds directly at the advancing orc band, a sonic assault from an unexpected quarter. The stakes of her musical gambit were terrifyingly high, a razor's edge with sheer drop on either side. If her plan worked, the sudden, alien, and piercing nature of the elven song would confuse and disorient the orcs. It might cause them to hesitate, to break their charge, to look skyward in baffled irritation, buying the eagles the precious seconds they needed to position themselves for a decisive counterattack. Her distraction could be the key that turned the tide, a non-lethal intervention that saved lives. But if it failed, if the orcs were not distracted, but instead enraged, or if their leader identified the source of the sound, she would achieve the opposite effect. She would paint a giant target on herself and Landruval, focusing the entire wrath of the band on their position. She would transform from a hidden observer into the primary target, escalating the danger for everyone, and potentially drawing the eagles into a defensive fight around her instead of an offensive strike against the foe. The effect was immediate and electric. The lead orcs, their crude minds already focused on the easy prey ahead, faltered in their charge. They stumbled, their heads snapping up toward the sky, their ugly faces contorted in confusion and rage at the shrill, unwelcome sound, disrupting their violent rhythm. For a handful of critical heartbeats, their advance stuttered, their formation loosening as they sought the source of the auditory assault. It was the opening the Lord of the Eagles needed. Seeing the momentary disruption in the enemy ranks, Gwaihir did not hesitate. With a cry that was less a sound and more a physical declaration of war, he folded his wings and dropped from the sky like a thunderbolt, his entire being focused on a single target. The largest orc, the one shouting orders and beating a crude drum, the leader of this wretched band. His talons, which could rend the scales of a dragon, were extended forward, poised for a strike that would end the fight before it could truly begin. The response from the eagles was not a battle, it was a force of nature unleashed. Gwaihir's dive was a blur of focused fury, a living avalanche of feather and talon that struck the orc chieftain with an impact that echoed across the clearing. The creature's guttural cry was cut short, its form swept aside like a leaf in a gale. Landruval, no longer a gentle rescuer, became a whirlwind of retribution. He did not merely attack, he orchestrated chaos. A single, powerful beat of his immense wings sent a shockwave of air and debris that knocked a half-dozen orcs from their feet, their crude weapons clattering uselessly on the stone. His talons, which had so carefully lifted children to safety, now struck with surgical precision, disarming and disabling, a calculated display of overwhelming power designed to break their spirit without the need for a prolonged slaughter. Elara watched, her disruptive song dying in her throat, replaced by a breathless silence of pure, unadulterated awe. This was the other side of the noble sentinels. She revered the fierce, untamable wrath that underpinned their legendary protection. It was one thing to read about their might in ancient scrolls. It was another entirely to witness it firsthand, to feel the concussive force of their wings in her own chest, to see the terrifying efficiency with which they dismantled a threat. The awe was swiftly followed by a cold prickle of horror, a stark reminder that the gentle giants who had accepted her song were also beings of immense and deadly power, their mercy a choice, not a limitation. This was the full, terrifying spectrum of their nature, and it left her trembling. A new, critical tension gripped her. The battle was not hers to fight, but her position on Landruval's back made her a glaringly obvious and utterly vulnerable target. To move was to risk unbalancing him at a crucial moment. To remain still was to be a stationary mark for any archer in the panicking orc band. Her role had to shift from active distraction to passive survival. She forced herself to flatten against his back, making her profile as small as possible, her eyes scanning the fray not for opportunities to help, but for incoming threats to avoid. She had to trust the eagles completely, to believe in their skill to such an extent that her own safety became a secondary concern to their freedom of movement. Her greatest contribution now was to not become a liability they were forced to defend. Yet, even in her fear, the scholar's mind could not be completely quieted. Her hands, acting almost of their own volition, began to make broad, sweeping gestures toward the group of dazed woodmen who were still caught in the open, caught between the retreating orcs and the advancing eagles. She pointed emphatically toward a large outcropping of rocks that offered solid cover, silently mouthing the word, "There." She knew her voice would be lost in the din, but a clear, directed motion might break through their shock and guide them to safety. It was a tiny act, a thread of assistance in a tapestry of violence, but it was all she could offer. She continued her piercing Elven song, not to disorient the orcs anymore, but to mask any sounds the fleeing woodmen might make, to cover their retreat with a wall of sound. The dynamics of the skirmish were a fragile thing, a balance that could tip in an instant. The orcs were disorganized and terrified, on the verge of a full, panicked rout back into the trees. But if their fear turned to desperate rage, if a single determined leader among them managed to rally a handful into a last, frenzied stand, the clean victory could quickly devolve into a messy, close-quarters brawl. And worse, the sound of battle was a beacon in the wild. What if the drums had not just been for this one band? What if they were a signal, drawing more orcs from deeper within the forest? Or worse, attracting the attention of a mountain troll or other fell creatures from the dark places? The eagles were mighty, but they were not invincible against endless numbers or a truly monstrous foe. The safety of everyone, the woodman, herself, even the eagles depended on a swift and decisive end to this fight. Seeing their leader fallen and their ranks shattered by the aerial onslaught, the remaining orcs' courage broke completely. Their aggressive shouts turned to screams of pure terror, and they turned to flee, scrambling over one another in their desperation to escape the wrath from the sky. A wave of palpable relief began to wash over the burning valley, but fate, it seemed, had one last cruel twist to offer. In his frantic flight, a lone orc archer, stumbling backward, loosed a single wild arrow skyward. It was not aimed, not even shot with intent, but was a product of blind panic and a fumbling hand. Yet its arc was true, a streak of dark wood and sharp iron, cutting through the smoky air, its path unwavering and deadly, flying directly toward Alara's heart. There was no time to shout, no time to even process the threat. It was simply there. Time seemed to warp and slow, the chaos of the battle fading into a muffled roar as Alara's world narrowed to that single, terrifying point of dark wood and sharp iron flying toward her. There was no time to react, no time to even flinch. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in a moment of pure, helpless anticipation. Then, a blur of bronze and gold filled her vision, a sudden, immense presence that blocked the sun and the sky. It was Landruval, moving with a speed that defied his size, interposing the great, feathered expanse of his wing between her and the arrow's path. The sound was not the thud she expected, but a sickening, wet tear, followed immediately by Landruval's sharp, guttural cry of pain, a sound of shock and agony that was utterly alien to his noble nature, and that lanced through her heart more painfully than any arrow could. The world rushed back in with a violent intensity. Elara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she saw the arrow shaft, grotesquely out of place, buried deep in the muscle of his primary wing. A dark, shocking stain of crimson began to spread rapidly across the beautiful, sun-gilded feathers, a brutal violation of his grace and power. A tsunami of emotions crashed over her, a dizzying, nauseating wave of relief at her own narrow escape, immediately swamped by a crushing, suffocating wave of guilt and horror. He had been injured. He, a sovereign of the sky, had been brought low by a stray shot meant for her because of her reckless decision to sing and draw attention. The gratitude she felt was immense and profound, but it was poisoned by the bitter certainty that this sacrifice should never have been necessary. The battle was not over. Below them, the remaining orcs, emboldened by the sight of the wounded eagle, let out a ragged cheer, their fear momentarily overcome by bloodlust. Gwaihir's furious cries echoed across the clearing as he redoubled his attacks, but the balance of the fight had shifted dangerously. Elara's mind, reeling from the shock, fought to regain its footing. This was no time for paralysis or self-recrimination. Panic was a luxury that would get them all killed. She forced herself to lean forward, her eyes scanning the injury with a frantic, clinical focus she didn't know she possessed. The arrow was embedded, but it hadn't shattered the bone. She could see that much. The immediate threat was blood loss, the steady, pulsing flow that weakened him with every beat of his great heart. Her decision was instantaneous, born of pure instinct and a desperate need to act. With fingers that trembled not from fear, but from a furious intensity, she tore at the clasp of her thick elven cloak. The heavy gray wool came away in her hands, and without a second thought, she leaned out as far as she dared, pressing the bundled fabric firmly against the wound, applying pressure around the base of the arrow shaft to stem the bleeding. Landruval flinched at the pressure, a shudder running through his powerful frame, but he held his flight steady, a testament to his incredible will. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, the words swallowed by the wind. "Just hold on, please hold on." But she knew that staunching the wound was only half the battle. Gwaihir was now fighting for two, his attacks ferocious, but his attention divided, constantly glancing back at his injured brother. Elara realized that her vantage point, high above the fray, was now her greatest asset. She became his eyes. Raising her voice into a clear, piercing shout, she directed her words toward the Lord of the Eagles. "Gwaihir, to your left. 3 are trying to flank the rocks where the woodmen hide. Another group is scattering into the birch grove. They are fleeing, not advancing." She translated the chaotic movements below into clear, tactical information. Her knowledge of strategy from old Elven war texts, merging with her sharp sight to provide a real-time assessment of the battlefield. She was no longer a passenger. She was part of their unit, a spotter in the sky, her voice a guide for his wrath. The stakes of this terrible new equilibrium were terrifyingly simple. Every second Landruval remained aloft with that arrow in his wing was a miracle of his endurance, but it was a miracle that could not last. If the wound grounded him, even for a moment, they would be forced to land in the midst of the still hostile environment. Gwaihir would be compelled to defend a static position, a disastrous scenario for a creature of the sky. Their aerial dominance, their greatest advantage, would be completely lost, leaving the weary woodman and a wounded eagle utterly vulnerable to a renewed orc assault. Elara's own safety, the success of the rescue, and Landruval's very life now hung in the balance of his strength and her ability to help guide them through the next few critical minutes. Below, Gwaihir seemed to hear her, to trust her. With a final, earth-shaking cry of pure fury that seemed to bend the very trees, he executed a last, coordinated strike. He drove his talons into the soft earth, kicking up a great cloud of dirt and ash to blind the remaining orcs, then beat his wings with such tremendous force that the resulting gale knocked the stragglers off their feet and sent them tumbling head over heels into the tree line. The will of the orcs broke completely. Their drums fell silent, their shouts turning to pure, panic screams as they fled in every direction, swallowed by the dark forest from which they came. As quickly as it had begun, the violence ended. The forest fell into an abrupt and profound silence, broken only by the low, hungry crackle of the dying fire and the ragged, pained rhythm of Landruval's breathing. The profound silence that settled over the forest in the wake of the orc's flight was heavy, thick with the lingering sense of smoke, blood, and spent adrenaline. For a long moment, the only sounds were the low crackle of dying embers and Landruval's ragged, pained breathing. Then, from behind the safety of the large rock outcropping, a figure emerged, hesitant at first, then another and another. The woodmen, their faces still smudged with soot and etched with the terror of the last hour, slowly approached, but their fear was gone, replaced by an awe so deep it bordered on reverence. They did not look at the mighty eagles as mere beasts or monsters, but as the noble, divine saviors of their oldest tales, made flesh. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard, stepped forward, his hand over his heart in a gesture of profound gratitude that needed no words. Seeing Landruval's injury, the arrow still standing starkly from his wing, the woodman's awe transformed instantly into a shared, determined concern. They moved not as frightened villagers, but as a community eager to repay an unimaginable debt. One hurried forward with a water skin of clean, cool water from the river. Another offered strips of clean, soft linen torn from his own tunic. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones, their rough hands moving with a surprising gentleness as they looked to Alara, the elf who rode the Sky Lords, for direction. The dynamic had completely shifted. They were no longer victims and rescuers, but allies bound together in the aftermath of a shared trial, united in their desire to aid the wounded guardian. Elara's hands, though still trembling slightly from the aftermath of the fight, moved with a purpose born of her Rivendell training. She accepted the offered water and cloth with a grateful nod, her focus entirely on Landruval. "I need to clean the area first," she explained softly, more to herself and the eagle than to the woodman. "Then we must bind it to stop the bleeding." From her travel-worn pack, she retrieved a small pouch of herbs Athelas, known for its cleansing and healing properties, and a few other leaves for pain and poultices. Crushing the Athelas in the clean water, the air was suddenly filled with its fresh, clean scent, a welcome relief from the acrid smoke, a smell of hope and renewal. She worked with a careful, deliberate tenderness, her touch light as she cleaned the blood from his beautiful feathers, her heart aching with every flinch he tried to suppress. As she worked, the woodmen did not stand idle. They built a small, safe fire away from the main burn, and from their own meager supplies salvaged from the edges of the fire's path, they brought out whey bread, dried fruit, and a skin of honeyed mead. They offered it not as a feast, but as a solemn offering of thanks, sharing their stories in low, earnest voices. They spoke of watching the fire take hold, of feeling trapped and hopeless, and then of the miraculous sight of the great eagles descending from the sky like something from a legend. They spoke of their village, their families, and how every single one of them owed their lives to the intervention from the heavens. Their words were not just gratitude, they were a testament, a living memory being forged in real time, and Alara listened, her work pausing for a moment as she understood that this was exactly the kind of true, earned reverence she had hoped to document. Yet, beneath her focus and the shared moment of peace, a cold knot of anxiety tightened in Alara's stomach. The arrow was out, the wound bound, but the damage was severe. She looked at the bulky bandage on his powerful wing, and a terrible doubt crept in. Could he fly? The journey back to the High Eyrie was long and required immense strength and precision. Would attempting it now risk further injury, perhaps even a fall, And then came the more insidious, guilty thought, slithering into her mind. Would they blame her? It was her song that had drawn the archer's aim. Her presence had complicated the rescue, turning it into a battle. Landruval's sacrifice, while noble, was a direct consequence of her decision to be more than an observer. Would Gwaihir's accepting gaze now turn to one of accusation? Would the trust she had worked so hard to earn vanish like smoke on the wind? This internal conflict crystallized into a single, unwavering resolve. She could not, would not, leave his side. Finishing the bandage with a firm but gentle knot, she turned to where Gwaihir stood vigil, his watchful eyes missing nothing. Her voice, though soft, was firm and carried a weight of absolute conviction. "I will not return with you tonight," she stated, not as a request, but as a declaration. "I will stay with Landruval. I will tend to his wound, change the poultices, and ensure his strength returns. I will walk every step of the way beside him, if that is what is required, but I will not leave until I am certain he can fly again." It was a pledge that came from a place of deep responsibility, a desire to mend what her actions had helped to break, and a genuine, profound affection for the brave eagle who had taken an arrow for her. The stakes of this vow were deeply personal, yet they resonated with the potential to redefine her entire future. This commitment meant a significant delay in her return to Rivendell. Lord Elrond would be waiting, her unexplained absence potentially causing worry or even displeasure among her people. Her mission, which had been about chronicling the eagles, was now personally invested in the recovery of one of them. But this was also a pivotal test of the bond she had begun to form. Her unwavering dedication to Landruval's well-being, her willingness to share in his hardship and slow journey, could forge a connection stronger than any shared song or story. It would prove her loyalty was not conditional on glory or access, but was rooted in a genuine, selfless care for them as individuals. It was the difference between being a welcomed guest and becoming a trusted friend. As the sun finally dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and orange, Gwaihir regarded her. His sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to weigh her promise, measuring the sincerity in her voice and the determination in her posture. After a long, silent moment, he gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble that held not anger, but a note of grave respect. "The night will provide cover for a slow journey," he said. "We will rest here. At first light, we begin the ascent. You will walk and we will guard." His statement was a plan, an acknowledgement of her pledge, and a promise of protection in return. The path forward was clear, a slow, deliberate journey home, taken together as night gave way to the hopeful light of a new dawn. The slow, deliberate journey back to the sacred eyrie was a pilgrimage of shared purpose, each step a testament to the bond forged in fire and sacrifice. Elara walked beside the great, grounded eagle, her hand often resting lightly on his uninjured shoulder in a gesture of steadying support, while Gwaihir circled above in a protective, watchful pattern. The pace was nothing like their previous flight. It was measured, patient, and deeply humbling. Upon their return, the atmosphere within the high sanctuary shifted from one of triumphant welcome to one of focused, communal care. A space was cleared for Landruval near the heart of the eyrie, a place of soft, dry moss and warm stone, and there the true work of healing began. Each dawn, as the first light touched the highest peaks, Alara was at his side. From her pack came the small, precious pouches of herbs she had gathered under the tutelage of Rivendell's finest healers. She crushed Athelas in clean water, its fresh, life-affirming scent cutting through the thin mountain air as she gently cleansed the wound, her touch as light as a falling feather. She sang as she worked, not the bold battle tunes or the complex wind songs, but the soft, ancient melodies of elven healing, songs that spoke of mending, of strength returning, of bone knitting, and pain receding. Her voice, a steady and gentle presence, became part of the airie's new rhythm, a sound of solace that the other eagles seemed to listen to with quiet approval. The results of her unwavering dedication were visible sooner than anyone could have hoped. Landruval's formidable vitality, a gift of his noble lineage, responded powerfully to the skilled care. The inflammation subsided, the deep tear began to close with clean, strong tissue, and a new, healthy gleam returned to his eyes. But the healing was more than just physical. With each passing day, the eagle's perception of Alara underwent a subtle and profound transformation. The curious scholar, the honored guest, was now something else entirely. She was the one who stayed. She was the one who applied the poultices with hands that never tired, who sang through the long, cold watches of the night when the wound ached most. She had become a trusted ally, a steadfast helper whose loyalty had been proven not in words, but in action. Yet, beneath the surface of her diligent care, a quiet storm of guilt raged. In the still moments, when Landruval slept and the only sound was the endless wind, her mind would circle back to that single, fateful moment in the burning forest. Her own voice, raised in a desperate distraction, had been the beacon that drew the archer's aim. That knowledge was a cold weight in her chest, a private burden she carried with her everywhere. She would look at the neatly bound wing, at the slight hitch in his otherwise regal posture, and feel a sharp pang of responsibility. But Alara was not one to be crippled by regret. Instead, she channeled that guilt into a fierce, burning fuel for her dedication. Every careful application of a herb, every verse of a healing song, became an act of atonement, a silent promise to mend what her presence had inadvertently broken. This internal struggle found its outlet in the pages of her journal. The entries from this period are some of the most poignant and detailed in the entire volume. Alongside her sketches of the injury's progression, clinical diagrams showing the knitting of tissue and the regrowth of feathers, she wrote not just as an observer, but as a participant. She documented the incredible resilience of the eagle's body, a physiology designed for endurance and rapid recovery. But more importantly, she began a new chapter, one she titled simply, of compassion and sacrifice. In it, she explored a revelation that went beyond mere biological wonder. She wrote of the profound compassion inherent in a being of such immense power, a creature who would consciously choose to intercept harm meant for another. She analyzed the event not as a tactical mistake, but as a defining act of nobility that spoke to the very heart of what made the Great Eagles the guardians of Middle-earth. The legacy she was building in those quiet days of recovery was being etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of the Aerie. Every eagle there witnessed her devotion. The stakes of her actions could not have been higher, for they would define how she was remembered for ages to come. Would her legacy be that of a helper, a genuine ally whose unique skills and unwavering heart had earned her a permanent place in their storied history? Or would the memory of her time with them be tinged with the shadow of being a burden, a well-meaning mortal whose presence ultimately cost one of their lords pain and a prolonged grounding? Her every action, every patient moment spent in care, was an argument for the former, a silent plea to be counted among the helpers of the world. After a week of this gentle, focused rhythm, a change occurred. Thorondor, the ancient elder, approached her as she was preparing the morning's poultice. His silver-white feathers seemed to catch the dawn light and hold it, and his eyes, older than the mountains, held a new and decisive glint. "The wing mends well, daughter of Elrond," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration of approval. "You have served your friend with a loyalty that does honor to your people and to ours. But the time for quiet healing is now past. The world below does not know of the vigil kept in these high places, of the sacrifices made for its peace. Your purpose was always greater than this single act of care. The time has come for you to share the truth you have witnessed. The time has come for your findings to go out into the world." The profound silence that had settled over the Eyrie in the wake of Thorondor's declaration was broken not by a sound, but by a shift in the very quality of the light. The ancient elder eagle turned his great, silver-white head toward the heart of the nesting grounds, and from a crevice in the sacred stone, bathed in a beam of high-altitude sun, he drew forth an object. It was a single feather, but unlike any Alara had ever seen or sketched. It was longer than her arm, its veins a perfect, pristine white that seemed to be woven from captured cloud, and yet at its core, it held a soft, internal luminescence, a gentle radiance that pulsed with the serene, timeless energy of the highest heavens. It was, she realized with a jolt that stole her breath, a primary feather from the wing of Manwe himself, or one of his earliest kin, imbued with the very light of the Elder King's domain. Thorondor held it with a reverence that was itself a form of speech. He did not merely hand it to her, he presented it, lowering the magnificent quill before her with a slow, ceremonial grace that made the air itself feel still and holy. "Take this," his voice resonated, not as a command, but as a bestowal. "Let it be a companion to your words and a seal upon your work. It is a token of our trust, and a light to guide your pen toward truth." Elara's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers closing around the shaft. It was surprisingly warm to the touch, and a profound sense of peace, of immense and ancient benevolence, flowed from it into her very being. This was more than a gift. It was a validation, a sacred endorsement that transformed her illicit notes and sketches from a personal journal into a sanctioned chronicle. The Eagles were not just allowing her to tell their story, they were entrusting her with it, and with that immense honor came a weight of responsibility so heavy it threatened to buckle her knees. The warm, living light of the feather in her hands felt less like a comfort and more like a silent, judging eye. She was no longer just Elara of Rivendell, a curious scholar. She had become a conduit, the sole mortal link between the secret, majestic world of the Eagles and the rest of Middle-earth. The words she would choose, the sketches she would finalize, the way she would frame their power and their purpose, all of it would now shape how an entire world perceived these noble beings. The trust was absolute, and the potential to betray it, even accidentally, felt like a terrifying abyss opening at her feet. A careless phrase could make them seem like mere monsters of legend. A misplaced emphasis could undermine the sacred gravity of their eternal vigil. The feather was not just a blessing, it was the weight of a legacy placed squarely upon her shoulders. In that moment of profound reckoning, standing before the assembled lords of the sky, Alara made a vow not to them, but to herself, a promise forged in the fires of humility and newfound purpose. She would not use this gift for glory or for pride. She would wield her pen as a weapon not of conquest, but of preservation. Her writings would be crafted to inspire not fear, but a deep and abiding respect. She would portray the eagles not as distant, indifferent gods, but as the vigilant, compassionate guardians they truly were, hoping that in understanding their value, the free peoples of Middle-earth would feel compelled to become protectors in their own right, to safeguard the wild places and ancient secrets that allowed such noble creatures to thrive. Her mission had crystallized. She would become a voice for the voiceless sentinels, a bridge of understanding built on a foundation of unwavering respect. The stakes of this personal oath were as vast as the sky itself. To honor this trust was to potentially change the course of history, to weave the great eagles back into the conscious fabric of the world, strengthening their legacy and ensuring that in future times of darkness, their allies would be many and their purpose universally understood. But to misuse it, to sensationalize or distort their truth for the sake of a thrilling tale, would be a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. It could shatter the fragile veil of secrecy that protected their Ares, drawing the curious, the greedy, and the malevolent to their sacred thresholds. It could turn them from respected guardians into hunted myths, their safety sacrificed on the altar of her own ambition. The feather in her hand was both a key to unparalleled understanding and a potential weapon of irrevocable harm, and its power was now hers to direct. As if sensing the immense burden of her thoughts and the long road that now lay ahead of her, Gwaihir stepped forward. The Lord of the Eagles dipped his magnificent head, his keen eyes holding a new, profound respect. "The winds now carry you home, chronicler," he said, his voice a low rumble of finality. "Your place is now among your own people, to share the light you have been given. I will bear you to Rivendell, to the halls of Lord Elrond. It is there that you must first present your findings, for his wisdom will help guide your truth into the world." The offer was both a kindness and a command, a recognition that her journey in the sky had reached its end, and her work in the world of men and elves was about to begin. The rush of wind was no longer a terrifying roar, but a familiar symphony, a chorus of the high air that now felt like a second home as Gwaihir carried her eastward. The world unspooled beneath them in a breathtaking tapestry of emerald forests and silver rivers, all peaceful and serene from this vantage point, a stark contrast to the fiery chaos she had so recently witnessed. Nestled safely within the pages of her journal, its leather cover now holding the impossibly warm, luminous weight of the eagle feather, was more than just a record of events. It was a piece of her soul, a testament to a transformation she could scarcely articulate. She was no longer the same elf who had secretly scaled a cliff face with nothing but academic curiosity. The journey had forged something new within her, a profound, unbreakable bond of loyalty, and a solemn understanding of the immense, silent duty that kept the shadows of the world at bay. She had gone as a scholar and returned as a sworn ally, a chronicler anointed by the skies themselves. Yet as the familiar, graceful spires of Rivendell came into view, nestled in its deep, green valley like a jewel set in living stone, a cold knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. The beauty of her home, usually a sight that filled her with instant peace, now seemed to hold a silent, judging gaze. Her quest had been one of pure intent, but it had also been an act of profound disobedience, a willful flouting of Elven traditions that valued secrecy and caution above all else. She had not sought permission from Lord Elrond. She had simply gone, driven by a fire he might see as reckless arrogance rather than admirable passion. And the secrets she now carried, the location of the sacred Eyrie, the depth of the eagle's intelligence, the very language of the wind, were not hers to share lightly. They were a sacred trust, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier with every beat of Gwaihir's powerful wings. The internal debate was a quiet storm. One voice, the voice of the cautious scholar she had once been, whispered that she should temper her report, carefully editing the truths she presented to avoid alarming the council or revealing too much. It urged a path of slow, cautious revelation, of measured words and political tact. But as she felt the solid presence of Gwaihir beneath her and the gentle pulse of the feather against her chest, that path felt like a betrayal. These noble beings had offered her their trust with an openness that had cost one of them blood and pain. They had judged her worthy of their deepest truths. To present their story with anything less than absolute, unvarnished honesty would be to disrespect that sacrifice and prove herself unworthy of the gift they had given her. Her loyalty, she realized, now belonged to two worlds, and she would have to navigate the divide between them with courage and integrity. Her decision crystallized into a firm, unwavering resolve as the courtyard of the last homely house rushed up to meet them. She would stand before Lord Elrond and the entire council and speak with the clarity and conviction the eagles themselves had shown her. She would hold nothing back. She would describe Gwaihir's piercing gaze not as a predator's stare, but as the look of an ancient, wise sovereign. She would recount Landruval's sacrifice, not as a simple act of bravery, but as a profound testament to a compassion that underpinned their immense power. She would emphasize, above all else, that their role was not one of isolated majesty, but of integral, essential guardianship, that the safety of Rivendell itself was intertwined with the vigilance of the high peaks. Her mission was no longer to prove a theory, but to build a bridge of understanding, and that bridge had to be built upon the strongest foundation of truth she could provide. The stakes of her impending audience could not have been higher, a pivot upon which her entire future would turn. Lord Elrond's reaction held the power to validate her life's work, to grant her the authority to formally chronicle the Eagle's legacy, so that all in Rivendell might learn from it, and perhaps even to open a new chapter of formal alliance and communication between the Elven realm and the Lords of the Air. His wisdom could help her frame this incredible truth for the wider world, but the opposite possibility was a chilling prospect. His displeasure could result in severe restrictions, forbidding her from any further contact with the Eagles, confiscating her precious journal for the sake of security, and relegating her groundbreaking work to the status of a forbidden, hidden text, its truths locked away and forgotten. The dream of sharing their marvels would end not with a roar, but with a quiet, crushing decree. Gwaihir's landing was, as always, a masterpiece of silent grace, his vast talons meeting the white stone of the courtyard with a soft, definitive click that echoed in the sudden stillness. The usual gentle murmur of the house, the soft music of waterfalls and conversation, seemed to halt all at once. Elara slid from his back, her legs slightly unsteady on the solid, unmoving ground, and turned to face the main archway. And there he was. Lord Elrond had emerged, drawn by the immense presence now gracing his home. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped before him, his ageless face an unreadable mask of calm authority. But his eyes, deep and gray as a twilight sea, were not fixed on her. They were locked on the magnificent Lord of the Eagles, standing protectively beside her, and in their depths, Alara could discern a complex mixture of deep respect, profound curiosity, and the first, faint traces of a dawning, immense concern. For a long moment, the only sound in the sun-drenched courtyard was the gentle murmur of the waterfalls and the soft rustle of Gwaihir's feathers as he settled his immense form. Elrond's gaze finally shifted from the legendary eagle to the young scholar standing before him, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fire he had never seen in her before. Without a word, her hands trembling only slightly, Alara offered him the 2 testaments of her journey, the worn leather journal, its pages filled with her meticulous script and drawings, and the single, luminous feather that seemed to hold a piece of the sky itself. As Elrond's fingers closed around the journal, his expression was one of stern, unreadable authority, the face of a lord who had governed this valley for ages and knew the price of reckless curiosity. Alara's voice, though initially soft, gained strength as she began to speak, weaving the tale of her forbidden quest. She did not plead or make excuses. Instead, she spoke with the quiet conviction of one who has witnessed a profound truth and feels compelled to share it. She described the perilous climb, the heart-stopping moment of discovery, and the terrifying yet awe-inspiring scrutiny of Gwaihir's gaze. Her words painted a vivid picture, not of a foolish intruder, but of a humble petitioner who had been granted an unprecedented audience. She spoke of Thorondor's ancient wisdom, his deep, resonant voice sharing histories older than the Elven kingdoms themselves, and of the sacred, wind-born language that served as the nervous system of their watch over Middle-earth. Most passionately, she recounted the forest fire and the orc attack, her voice catching as she described Landruval's sacrifice, the swift, selfless act of taking an arrow meant for her, a moment that transformed her from an observer into a sworn ally, forever bound to their noble cause. As she spoke, a subtle but profound change came over Lord Elrond. The initial sternness in his ageless eyes, the tight line of his mouth, began to soften. It was not her words alone that wrought this change, but the evidence he held in his hands. As he carefully turned the pages of her journal, he saw not the reckless scribblings of a disobedient child, but the work of a master chronicler. The sketches were breathtakingly accurate, capturing not just the physical form of the eagles, but their essence, their intelligent, piercing eyes, the powerful grace of their flight, the regal dignity of their posture. The notes were precise, insightful, and filled with a deep, abiding reverence that shone through every line. And then there was the feather, its gentle, internal light pulsed softly in his hand, a tangible, undeniable artifact of immense power and sanctity. This was no trinket. It was a token of supreme trust, a blessing from the highest authority, and its very presence, validated every word she spoke, silencing any doubt about the truth of her extraordinary tale. Yet, even as the truth of her journey settled upon him, a familiar, weighty conflict arose within Elrond. For millennia, his people had valued secrecy and caution above almost all else. The hidden valleys, the cloaking mists, the unlisted paths, these were the safeguards that had preserved Elven culture from the relentless tides of darkness and time. To openly acknowledge the Eagles, to bring their secrets into the light of common knowledge, felt like a dangerous gamble. Would it foster the respect Alara envisioned, or would it inevitably draw the wrong kind of attention? Would it inspire alliance, or would it tempt the greedy and the powerful to seek out the Ares, to try and harness the Eagle's might for their own ends? The Lord in him, the guardian of his people's safety, screamed for discretion, for locking this knowledge away to protect both the Eagles and the delicate balance of the world. Seeing the conflict play out across his features, Alara found a courage she didn't know she possessed. She stepped forward, her voice firm and clear, addressing him not as a chastised student to her master, but as one guardian of Middle-earth's light to another. "My lord," she said, her gaze steady, "secrecy has been our shield, I know this, but can a shield also become a cage? The Eagles are not a secret to be kept, they are a truth to be honored. If the free people's elves, men, dwarves, and hobbits alike understood the vigilant protectors who watch over them from the high places, would it not strengthen their own resolve to fight the shadows? Would it not forge a greater alliance, one built on shared reverence for the defenders of our world? To let them fade into myth is to forget a pillar of our own defense. But to acknowledge them is to acknowledge that we are not alone in this struggle, that majesty and strength still stand guard between us and the darkness." The silence that followed her words was heavier than any that had come before. The entire fate of her work, and potentially the future relationship between Rivendell and the Eagles, hung in that quiet space. Gwaihir remained a silent, powerful monument to her story, his presence a constant, undeniable pressure on Elrond's judgment. The Lord's eyes moved from Alara's earnest face to the glowing feather, then to the journal filled with undeniable truth, and finally to the majestic eagle who had borne his friend Gandalf from certain doom. He was weighing ages of cautious tradition against a single, brilliant point of undeniable, transformative truth. The decision he made in that moment would ripple through the ages, determining whether the Great Eagles would remain elusive figures of whispered legend or take their rightful place in the conscious mind of Middle-earth as acknowledged, revered sentinels. Then the tension broke. A slow, deep smile, one of immense wisdom and dawning pride, spread across Lord Elrond's face. It was not a smile of simple amusement, but one of profound understanding and acceptance. He looked at Elara not as a wayward child, but as a visionary whose courage had unveiled a wonder he himself had only ever glimpsed from afar. "The light of truth is a gift that should never be hidden," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound warmth that filled the courtyard. "Your courage, Elara, has brought us more than a story. It has brought us understanding. This work, this testament, it shall not be locked away. It will be preserved and honored in the great library of Rivendell, copied and studied, so that all who dwell here may learn of the Great Eagles of Manwë and understand the depth of the vigilance that guards our world." His declaration was more than just permission. It was a sanctification of her life's purpose, a promise that the bridge she had built would now be open for all to cross. The great hall of Rivendell was filled with a silence so profound it felt like the very air was holding its breath. Every elf, from the highest counselor to the youngest scribe, sat in rapt attention, their eyes fixed not on their lord, but on the young scholar standing humbly in the center of the chamber. Elara, her traveling clothes still bearing the faint scent of wood smoke and high mountain air, held her journal open with hands that did not tremble. Behind her, framed by the grand open arches of the hall, was a sight that would be etched into Elven memory for ages to come. The immense, majestic form of Gwaihir, Lord of the Eagles, perched upon a stone balcony, his sharp eyes watching the assembly with a calm, ancient patience. He was no mere spectator. He was a living testament, a sovereign from the sky, bearing witness to the tale about to unfold. Alara's voice, when she began to read, did not start as a whisper, but carried with it a steady, clear passion that filled the space. She did not merely recite words from a page. She poured forth the soul of her experience. She spoke of heroism, not as a grand, abstract concept from an old song, but as a tangible force she had witnessed in the burning forest. The selfless dive of Landruval to shield her from the arrow, the powerful, wind-creating wingbeats of Gwaihir to save the trapped woodman. She described their wisdom, not as a distant, cold intelligence, but as the profound, patient understanding in Thorondor's eyes, as he shared histories that predated the sun and moon. And she spoke of their vigilance, painting a vivid picture of the dawn patrol, of eyes that missed nothing, that tracked the migration of herds and the gathering of storms with the same sacred duty as they watched for the shadow of orcs. As her words wove through the hall, something remarkable began to happen. The initial skepticism and stern curiosity on the faces of the Elven Council softened, replaced by looks of dawning wonder and deep respect. They were not just hearing a report, they were being transported. Through her passionate account, they could feel the thin, cold air of the sacred Eyrie. They could see the shimmering light of the gifted feather. They could understand the weight of the trust that had been placed in one of their own. She was not just telling them about the eagles. She was making them understand why the eagles mattered, not as myth, but as the most essential of allies, the silent partners in the eternal watch over Middle-earth. She was building a bridge of understanding, stone by stone, word by word, between the world of the valley and the realm of the sky. When her final word fell, a note of completion and truth hanging in the air, the silence returned, deeper and more potent than before. It was a silence of collective absorption, of minds and hearts processing a truth that would forever change their perception of the world. And in that perfect, suspended moment, Gwaihir acted. Throwing back his great head, he let out a cry. But this was not the fierce battle cry of the forest, nor the soft melodic call of the wind's speech. This was a mighty, resonant sound that seemed to draw from the very heart of the mountains themselves. It was a cry of acknowledgement, of solidarity, and of profound respect. It echoed through the hall, not as a deafening roar, but as a powerful vibration that shook the crystal goblets on the tables and resonated in the chest of every elf present. It was the voice of the sky, affirming the truth of the words just spoken. The sound did not fade so much as it settled, weaving itself into the very fabric of Rivendell, becoming a part of its history. In its wake, the understanding in the room was absolute and unspoken. The eagles were not just neighbors, They were kindred spirits in the guardianship of all that was good. And Elara was no longer just a scholar or a diplomat. In that moment, surrounded by the silent awe of her people and the echoing affirmation from the sky, her role was solidified forever. She had become the bridge, a living link between two ancient peoples, a translator of majesty and the keeper of a testament that would ensure the Great Eagles of Manwë would never again be forgotten, but would forever be honored as the noble sentinels they truly are. And so, Elara's life found its new rhythm, a beautiful harmony woven from the quiet scholarship of Rivendell and the soaring freedom of the high peaks. Her journal, once a secret, personal treasure, was now a revered text within Lord Elrond's library, its pages carefully copied by scribes so that its wisdom could be shared. Young elves, who had once only whispered the eagles' names in tales of ancient days, now pored over her detailed sketches of feather patterns and flight dynamics, her maps of patrol routes, and her transcriptions of Thorondor's histories. They didn't just learn about the eagles, they began to understand them, to see the profound intelligence and deep compassion behind the legends. Alara herself became a quiet but respected teacher, her words carrying a weight of lived experience that the oldest scrolls could not match. She spoke not of distant myths, but of friends of Gwaihir's piercing gaze that held the wisdom of the ages, of Landruval's gentle strength and the warmth of his feathers, of the resonant sound of wind speech that still echoed in her dreams. Her journeys to the mountains were no longer forbidden quests, but welcomed pilgrimages. Often, she would simply sit on a sun-warmed ledge near the sacred eyrie, not as an observer, but as an honored guest. Gwaihir and Landroval would greet her not with the formal curiosity of their first meeting, but with the easy, comfortable familiarity of old comrades. They would share the silence of the high places, a companionship that needed no words. Sometimes they would bring her gifts, a unique, iridescent feather shed during a molt, a smooth river stone from a valley they had patrolled, their way of including her in the ongoing story of their watch. In these moments, the divide between elf and eagle, mortal and immortal, seemed to vanish, replaced by a shared purpose and a mutual respect that transcended the very nature of their beings. Yet, with this deep connection came a poignant, bittersweet understanding that settled in Alara's heart like the first chill of autumn. Her life, though long by the measure of men, was but a single, fleeting season in the endless span of the eagle's existence. She would watch them, timeless and majestic, against the eternal peaks, and feel the profound contrast between her own brief flicker and their enduring vigil. This knowledge, however, did not bring her sorrow, but a fierce and focused determination. The brevity of her own time made her mission all the more urgent and vital. She became a vessel, dedicated to preserving every detail, every nuance of their being, so that the memory of their majesty would not fade with her passing, but would be passed down, bright and undimmed, for generations to come. Her greatest comfort, the thought that truly stilled any whisper of melancholy, was the knowledge that she had succeeded in her most heartfelt goal. The marvel of the Great Eagles, their true nature as the noble, vigilant, and compassionate sentinels of Manwe, would never again be forgotten or reduced to a simple child's rhyme. They were now enshrined in the living memory of her people, their role acknowledged and honored. She had built a bridge of understanding that would stand long after she was gone, ensuring that whenever a shadow threatened the peace of Middle-earth, the free peoples would remember to look to the skies with hope, knowing that magnificent guardians watched over them all. Her legacy was not carved in stone, but written on the wind, a permanent part of the story she had worked